Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I am a horror fan. I've been listening to this podcast for many years, and I've been wanting to post a story myself. Now recently, I've experienced something that I will truly never forget. I'm a 47-year-old man, 6'4" with a good build, and I live in California. What happened to me in March of 2022 changed everything I thought I knew about the world. I'm an avid hiker and walker, going everywhere with my wife, my 4-year-old daughter, and my 10-pound Central Asian Shepherd puppy Titan. That particular Tuesday started like any other. I had dragged myself through another exhausting day at the office, my shoulders tight with stress. The argument with my colleagues still rang in my ears. We had nearly come to blows over a project deadline, and the tension left me feeling raw and restless. When I finally got home that evening around 7:30, my wife was sprawled on the couch, dark circles under her eyes from her own demanding day. She worked as a nurse at the county hospital, and her 12-hour shifts were taking their toll. I kissed her forehead and suggested I take Titan out for a long walk so she could rest. She mumbled something about being careful and closed her eyes. I had been reading about this particular trail for weeks. Other hikers raved about its beauty at night, claiming the stars seemed close enough to touch through the canyon walls. The reviews described it as peaceful, almost spiritual. After the day I'd had, I craved that kind of solitude. I needed to clear my head, to breathe air that wasn't recycled through office vents. By 8 p.m. I had loaded Titan into my truck along with my .44 Magnum revolver. Crime rates in our area had spiked over the past 6 months. 3 home invasions within a mile of our house, 2 carjackings at the shopping center. The local news kept warning people to stay vigilant. I wasn't taking chances, especially alone on a remote trail after dark. The parking area was empty when I arrived, just cracked asphalt and a weathered wooden sign marking the trailhead. My headlights swept across the entrance before I killed the engine. The silence that followed felt heavy, pressing against my eardrums. Titan whined softly from the back seat, eager to explore. I clipped on his leash and grabbed my flashlight, the .44 Magnum secure in its holster at my hip. The weight of it was reassuring. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow dirt path ahead. Trees crowded in on both sides, their branches forming a twisted canopy overhead that blocked out most of the starlight I'd come to see. We started walking, Titan's nose working overtime as he investigated every rock, every bush, every scent marker left by previous visitors. His tail wagged with pure joy, and I felt some of my tension begin to ease. The night air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine and earth. My footsteps crunched on loose gravel, a steady rhythm that was almost meditative. The trail wound upward, becoming steeper. My calves burned pleasantly as we climbed. I could hear small animals rustling in the underbrush, the occasional hoot of an owl somewhere in the distance. Normal sounds, natural sounds. Everything felt right. We were approximately 45 minutes into the hike when Titan suddenly stopped. His whole body went rigid. His head lowered as he sniffed at a particular spot near the edge of the trail. Then he squatted to relieve himself, and I waited patiently, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. That's when I heard it. The distinct crunch of leaves being compressed underfoot. Not the random scatter of small wildlife, but deliberate weighted steps. Human-sized steps. My hand instinctively moved toward my gun. Then came the voice. "Over here." Just 2 words, whispered but clear enough to make every hair on my neck stand straight up. The voice was wrong somehow, too breathy, too hollow, like air forced through a damaged windpipe. I practice kickboxing 3 times a week. I'm not a small man, and I can handle myself in most confrontations, so I turned toward the sound, ready to face whoever was trying to mess with me. Maybe some punk kids thought they'd scare a lone hiker. Maybe a homeless person was camping in the woods. My jaw clenched as I prepared to tell them to back off. But Titan reacted before I could. He barked once. A sharp, explosive sound that shattered the quiet, and then he was gone. His leash ripped from my hand as he lunged off the trail and crashed into the dense forest, his huge body disappearing into the darkness between the trees. "Titan," I screamed, my voice cracking with panic. That dog was family. The thought of losing him sent ice water flooding through my veins. Without thinking, I plunged after him into the tree line, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I ran. Branches whipped at my face, drawing blood from my cheeks. Thorny brambles tore at my clothes and skin. I could hear Titan crashing through the underbrush ahead of me, but I couldn't see him. My new athletic pants, the expensive ones my wife had bought me for my birthday, were getting shredded by every bush I pushed through. Titan. I kept calling, desperation making my voice hoarse. Titan, come. Then I hit something. Hard. The impact was like running full speed into a brick wall. My feet left the ground, and I went down, slamming into the forest floor. Mud soaked through my pants, cold and thick. My flashlight flew from my hand, its beam spinning crazily before landing several feet away, pointing back the way I'd come. Gasping, I scrambled to my hands and knees, reaching for the light. My fingers closed around it, and I started to push myself up. That's when the beam swept across something that made my brain simply stop processing. There was a figure standing 10 feet in front of me, but calling it a figure felt wrong. It was shaped vaguely like a person. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head. But everything about it was distorted, stretched, corrupted. It stood at least 10 feet tall, its impossibly long limbs ending in hands with fingers that seemed to have too many joints. The skin was a sickly gray white, pulled so tight over the bones that I could see every ridge of its skull, every knob of its spine. But the face, God help me, the face was what destroyed me. Its eyes were completely white. No iris, no pupil. Just blank globes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The mouth hung open, revealing teeth that were too long, too sharp, stained dark with something I didn't want to identify. Thick, viscous drool hung from its lower lip in long strands, and I could see smears of crimson around its mouth, dried blood crusted in the corners. My voice, when it finally worked, came out as a broken whisper. What the hell? The thing's head tilted at an unnatural angle, almost 90 degrees to the side, like a curious dog examining something it didn't understand. Its white eyes seemed to bore into me, though they showed no recognition, no intelligence, nothing human. Then its mouth opened wider, the jaw stretched impossibly far, unhinging like a snake's, and it screamed. The sound that came out wasn't anything that should exist in nature. It was the shriek of a man being torn apart mixed with the roar of an enraged bear and the howling of a wolf, all layered on top of each other in a horrible harmony that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The scream went on, so loud that I felt it vibrating in my chest cavity, shaking my ribs. I stumbled backward, my legs barely supporting me. What the hell? I whispered again, because those were the only words my terrified brain could produce. My hands shook so badly that the flashlight beam danced across the trees like a strobe light. The creature dropped to all fours with a sickening crack of joints bending wrong. And then it moved. God, it moved faster than anything that size should be able to move. 1 second it was 10 feet away, the next it was right in front of me. Close enough that I could smell it, a nauseating mixture of rot and copper and something acrid that burned my nostrils. My hand went to my hip, muscle memory from countless hours at the shooting range taking over. I yanked the .44 Magnum from its holster and fired. The muzzle flash lit up the forest like lightning, and the recoil nearly knocked me backward. The first shot caught it square in the chest. I saw the impact, saw the skin split and dark liquid spray out. The thing screamed again, that same horrible multi-layered sound, but it didn't fall. It stumbled back maybe 2 steps, and I fired again. The second bullet hit it somewhere in the torso. I couldn't tell exactly where because my hands were shaking too hard to aim properly. This time it went down, crashing to the ground with enough force to shake the earth beneath my feet. Crimson liquid pooled beneath it, black in my flashlight beam. I stood there, gasping for air, waiting for it to stop moving, praying for it to stop moving. But it pushed itself up. Those impossibly long arms straightened, lifting its massive frame off the ground. The bullet wounds in its chest leaked dark blood, but it barely seemed to notice. It made a noise that might have been anger or pain or hunger, I couldn't tell, and started moving toward me again. That's when pure animal instinct kicked in. Every nerve in my body screamed the same message: run. I ran. I crashed through the forest, branches tearing at my face and arms, roots trying to trip me with every step. Help, I screamed, even though I knew there was no one to hear me. Somebody help me. Behind me, I could hear it coming. the crack of breaking branches, the heavy thud of its body hitting the ground with each loping stride. It was breathing, harsh, wet sounds like lungs full of fluid trying to draw air. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. It was maybe 20 feet back, closing the distance with terrifying speed, running on all fours like some nightmare version of a gorilla. I spun and fired blindly. The shot went wild, hitting a tree trunk and sending bark flying. I fired again. This one might have hit it. I heard it make that awful sound again, but it didn't slow down. It just kept coming, and I realized with horror that my .44 Magnum, a gun powerful enough to drop a bear, was doing nothing but annoying this thing. My mind raced with impossible questions even as I ran. How strong was this creature? What was it? Why wasn't it dying? If something like this existed, why had no one ever captured footage of it? Why weren't there bodies, evidence, proof? But there was no time to process any of this. There was only the burning in my lungs, the fire in my legs, and the sound of death chasing me through the dark. Then, exactly like in every horror movie I'd ever mocked, my foot caught on something. A root, a rock. I never saw what. My ankle twisted with a sharp crack of pain and I went down hard. My head bounced off something solid and stars exploded across my vision. For a moment I thought I might pass out. I rolled onto my back, trying desperately to stand, but my ankle wouldn't support my weight. When I put pressure on it, agony shot up my leg like an electric current. I was helpless, sprawled in the mud and leaves, watching as the creature bounded toward me. It was still dripping blood from the bullet wounds, still making those horrible wet breathing sounds. Drool and blood flew from its mouth as it ran, spattering the ground. It was moving at least twice as fast as any human could run, maybe faster. Its eyes, those dead white eyes, were locked onto me with the focus of a predator that knows its prey is wounded. I raised the gun with both hands, trying to steady my aim, but I was shaking too badly. The creature gathered itself and leaped, launching its massive body into the air in a perfect predatory arc, like a mountain lion pouncing on a deer. I was about to die. I knew it with absolute certainty. This thing was going to land on me and tear me apart. Then something huge and brown crashed into the creature from the side. Titan. My beautiful, loyal Titan hit the creature's head with his full 110 pounds of muscle and fury. The impact knocked the creature sideways, sending it tumbling. Before it could recover, Titan was on top of it, his massive jaws clamping down on whatever he could reach. I heard the wet sound of teeth tearing through flesh. The creature shrieked and thrashed, trying to shake Titan off, but my dog held on with the determination of his breed. Titan was bred to fight wolves, to protect livestock from predators. Every instinct in his body was focused on one goal: protect his pack. Protect me. I forced myself onto my knees, ignoring the searing pain in my ankle. I had to help him. I had to do something. I waited for an opening, watched the creature's writhing body, looking for a clear shot that wouldn't risk hitting Titan. There, for just a second, I could see the creature's head clearly. I fired. The bullet hit somewhere near its neck or shoulder. The creature's scream was deafening. I fired again. I couldn't tell if I was hitting it or missing. My hands shook so badly that every shot was a gamble. Then the creature did something I still have nightmares about. It simply ripped the flesh that Titan was biting. Just tore it off like someone removing a piece of clothing. A whole section of skin and muscle peeled away, and Titan went flying backward with the chunk still in his mouth. He hit a tree trunk with a yelp of pain and confusion. The creature turned its full attention to me. The exposed muscle where it had torn away its own flesh glistened wetly in my flashlight beam. It should have been debilitating. It should have been fatal. Instead, it just made the thing angrier. It looked at me with what I can only describe as pure hatred, those white eyes somehow conveying murderous rage despite having no pupils to focus. It opened its mouth impossibly wide and screamed directly at me. The sound was so loud this close that my ears rang and pain lanced through my skull. Then it started moving toward me again. Slower now, but with terrible purpose. "Titan," I screamed. "Come here, boy. Come on." Titan shook himself and scrambled to his feet. I saw blood around his muzzle, but I couldn't tell if it was his or the creature's. He ran to my side just as I managed to haul myself upright, putting all my weight on my good leg. Together, we started moving. The adrenaline flooding my system did something miraculous to my ruined ankle. I still felt the pain. God, it was excruciating. But my body simply overrode it, Survival instinct pushed me through agony that should have left me crawling. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, Titan matching my pace, his body pressed against my leg as if trying to support me. We burst through the tree line and onto the trail. I didn't know which direction we'd come from. I just picked a direction and ran. My lungs burned. My vision tunneled. My ankles screamed with every step. But I didn't stop. We must have covered a mile before I dared to look back. The trail behind us was empty, just darkness and distant trees. I bent over, hands on my knees, trying not to vomit from the exertion and terror. Titan stood next to me, panting hard, his eyes scanning the forest. Then I heard it again. That scream. Distant now, but still unmistakable. That impossible combination of human and animal and something other. It echoed through the canyon, and I swear I felt it in my bones. "Move," I gasped to Titan. "We have to move." We ran again. My truck appeared ahead like a salvation. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them twice before getting the door open. Titan jumped into the back seat. I threw myself behind the wheel, started the engine, and floored it. The truck's tires spun in the dirt before catching, and we shot forward in a cloud of dust and gravel. I didn't slow down until I hit pavement, and even then I kept the speedometer pushing 70 on roads meant for 45. When I burst through our front door, my wife took one look at me and went pale. I was covered in mud, blood, and scratches. My ankle was swollen to twice its normal size. Titan's muzzle was stained dark red, his coat matted with debris. I told her everything, every detail. The voice in the woods, the creature, the chase, the shooting, Titan's rescue. I spoke so fast that I was stumbling over my words, my hands gesturing wildly as I tried to make her understand the horror of what I'd seen. She stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "You're drunk," she finally said. "You went to O'Malley's pub after your hike and got drunk." "I'm not drunk. I swear to God I'm not drunk. Look at me. Look at Titan." But she was already grabbing her keys.
You need a hospital. I don't know what happened to you, but you're not making sense and your ankle is broken. We're going, now.
She wouldn't discuss it further. She helped me to the car, loaded Titan into the back, and drove us to the emergency room. The doctors x-rayed my ankle, severely sprained, not broken but close, and cleaned the cuts on my face and arms. They checked Titan and found he was miraculously uninjured. All the blood in his mouth belonged to something else. When they asked what happened, I told them I'd fallen while hiking. They gave me painkillers and crutches and sent me home. For the next week, I couldn't stop researching. I scoured the internet for anything that matched what I'd seen. The descriptions I found were terrifyingly similar to my encounter. Other people had seen things like this in remote areas. Most of their stories were dismissed as hoaxes or hallucinations. But what scared me most were the accounts that talked about these things following people home, stalking them, appearing outside windows. I couldn't sleep for days. Every sound in the night made me reach for my gun. I kept all the lights on. I checked the locks obsessively. Titan became my constant companion, more than before. I bought him the biggest, most expensive steak I could find at the butcher shop. He'd saved my life, and there was no way to adequately repay that debt. While I ate my meals, he got his own plate at the table. My wife thought I was having a breakdown, but she didn't argue. It's been 18 months now since that night in March 2022. I haven't seen the creature again. I haven't heard that scream. But I've never gone back to that trail. I rarely hike at all anymore, and when I do, it's only on popular trails in broad daylight with Titan at my side and my .44 Magnum loaded with fresh ammunition. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I stand at my bedroom window and stare into our backyard. The security lights I installed illuminate every corner, but shadows still gather beneath the trees at the property line. I watch those shadows, waiting, wondering if someday I'll see those white eyes staring back at me. My wife thinks I had some kind of mental break that night. She suggested therapy, and I went a few times, but how could I tell a therapist the truth? How could I explain that the world contains things that shouldn't exist? That there are creatures in the dark that can take multiple .44 Magnum rounds and barely slow down? I don't talk about it anymore, but I keep my gun cleaned and loaded. I keep Titan close, and I keep watching the shadows, because part of me has always known, that what I encountered that night is still out there somewhere in the dark, California hills, waiting for the next person stupid enough to walk those trails alone after dark. The worst part is not knowing what it was. not understanding why it exists or how it can exist, just knowing that it does, and that knowledge changes everything. The world is not as safe or as understood as we like to believe. There are things in the dark that we are not meant to see, and once you've seen them, you can never truly unsee them. I tell myself I was lucky. I had Titan. I had a gun. I survived. But sometimes survival isn't enough to feel safe again. Sometimes survival just means you get to lie awake at night, remembering white eyes in the darkness, and wondering if they're remembering you too. I never really considered myself an outdoorsy person until my family adopted Luna when I was 16. She was a golden retriever mix with the most expressive brown eyes I'd ever seen on an animal. Living in our small rural town meant endless opportunities for exploration, and Luna's boundless energy demanded daily adventures through the winding dirt paths that snaked through the dense forest surrounding our property. The town itself was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the local diner served as both restaurant and gossip central, and where the nearest shopping mall was a 40-minute drive away. Our house sat on the outskirts, bordered by hundreds of acres of untamed woodland that stretched as far as the eye could see. My parents had chosen this location specifically for the privacy and tranquility it offered, but they hadn't anticipated how that isolation would affect their teenage son. Those first few months with Luna transformed my daily routine completely. Where I once spent afternoons glued to video games or scrolling through social media, I now found myself lacing up hiking boots and grabbing Luna's leash. She had this infectious enthusiasm that made even the most mundane walk feel like an expedition into uncharted territory. Her tail would start wagging the moment she saw me reach for the leash, and her excited whimpers would echo through the house until we finally stepped outside. Our early expeditions followed the well-worn trails that other locals had carved through the forest over the years. These paths were safe, predictable, and led to familiar clearings where Luna could run freely while I sat on fallen logs and enjoyed the peaceful sounds of nature. But as weeks turned into months, I began to notice Luna's growing restlessness with our routine routes. She would strain against her leash whenever we passed certain spots, her nose twitching as she caught scents that led deeper into the wilderness. It was during one particularly warm afternoon in late spring when I first decided to venture off the established trails. Luna had been pulling toward a narrow deer path that disappeared into a thicket of overgrown brush, and my curiosity finally overcame my caution. We pushed through the tangled vegetation, branches catching on my clothes and thorns scraping against my arms, until we emerged into a hidden meadow that took my breath away. The clearing was completely enclosed by towering pine trees, creating a natural cathedral where sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden beams. Wildflowers dotted the tall grass and butterflies danced lazily through the warm air. Luna immediately bounded into the open space, her joyful barks echoing off the surrounding trees as she chased after invisible prey. In that moment, I understood what had been calling to her from beyond the familiar paths. From that day forward, our walks became true adventures. We discovered forgotten creek beds where crystal clear water bubbled over smooth stones, found ancient oak trees with trunks so massive that 3 people holding hands couldn't have encircled them, and stumbled upon rocky outcroppings that offered panoramic views of the endless forest canopy. Each expedition revealed new wonders, and I began to understand why people spoke of nature with such reverence and respect. But with each venture deeper into the wilderness, I also became increasingly aware of how quickly one could become lost in this vast expanse of green. The trails we created on our journeys were often invisible on our return trips, and more than once I found myself relying entirely on Luna's superior sense of direction to guide us back home. The forest seemed to shift and change when you weren't paying attention, paths disappearing and new obstacles appearing as if the woods themselves were alive and constantly rearranging their layout. 3 months into our off-trail adventures, I began to notice subtle changes in the areas we explored. The deeper we ventured into the forest, the quieter everything became. The cheerful bird songs that accompanied our earlier hikes gradually faded to an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the sound of our footsteps on the forest floor and Luna's occasional sniffing investigations. The trees themselves seemed different too, older and more gnarled, their branches reaching across the narrow paths like skeletal fingers trying to block our passage. Thick moss covered everything in a green blanket that muffled sound and created an almost tomb-like atmosphere. Even on bright sunny days, very little light managed to penetrate the dense canopy overhead, leaving us walking through a perpetual twilight that played tricks on the eyes. Luna's behavior during these deeper excursions began to concern me. Where she had once bounded ahead with carefree enthusiasm, she now stayed closer to my side, her ears constantly swiveling to catch sounds I couldn't hear. Her usual playful demeanor was replaced by a heightened alertness that made her seem more like a guard dog than the friendly companion I knew her to be. Several times I caught her staring fixedly into the shadows between the trees, her body tense and ready for flight, though I never saw anything that might have captured her attention. The forest floor in these areas was carpeted with layers of decomposing leaves and fallen branches that created a spongy, uneven surface beneath our feet. Every step released the musty smell of decay, and occasionally my foot would break through the surface layer to sink into the soft black soil beneath. Strange fungi sprouted from rotting logs in bizarre shapes and colors, some glowing with an eerie phosphorescence that seemed unnatural in the dim light. It was during one of these deeper expeditions that I first noticed the smell. At first, I dismissed it as just another aspect of the forest's natural decomposition process. But as we continued walking, the odor grew stronger and more distinct. It wasn't the clean scent of rotting vegetation, but something far more unpleasant. A sickly sweet smell that reminded me of the time a mouse had died inside the walls of our house and taken weeks to discover. Luna's reaction to the smell was immediate and intense. Her hackles rose along her spine, and she began to whimper in a way I'd never heard before. She kept looking back toward the path we'd come from, clearly wanting to retreat, but I was too curious about the source of the odor to turn back. Against my better judgment, I encouraged her forward, following the increasingly powerful scent deeper into the forest. The trees grew even more densely packed as we continued, their trunks creating a maze-like environment where it became impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. The temperature seemed to drop noticeably, and I found myself shivering despite the warm weather we'd left behind in the more open areas of the forest. Even the air felt different here, thicker, more oppressive, as if it carried some invisible weight that pressed down on everything it touched. When we finally discovered the source of the smell, I immediately understood Luna's reluctance to continue. Hidden in a small depression between several massive tree trunks was the decomposing carcass of what had once been a large deer. The animal had been dead for some time, its body bloated and discolored, with empty eye sockets that stared sightlessly up at the canopy overhead. Flies swarmed around the remains in thick black clouds, their buzzing creating the only sound in the otherwise silent forest. But what disturbed me most wasn't the sight of the dead animal itself. Death was a natural part of the forest ecosystem, after all. What made my stomach turn was the way the deer appeared to have died. There were no obvious signs of predation, no wounds or injuries that would explain its demise. It simply lay there as if it had chosen that spot to curl up and stop breathing, its legs tucked beneath its body in an almost peaceful pose that seemed completely at odds with the horrific state of decay surrounding it. The discovery of the dead deer should have been a warning to stay away from that particular area of the forest. But instead, it only intensified my curiosity about the deeper regions we were exploring. Over the following weeks, I found myself drawn back to those darker, quieter sections of the woods, despite Luna's obvious reluctance to accompany me there. During these return visits, I began to notice other disturbing details that I had missed during our first encounter. The vegetation around the deer's remains was withered and brown, despite the lush green growth that surrounded the area. It was as if some invisible circle of death extended outward from the carcass, creating a barrier that even the hardiest plants couldn't cross. The few trees that stood within this dead zone had lost their leaves entirely, their bare branches reaching toward the sky like desperate hands pleading for help. More concerning still were the other remains I began to discover scattered throughout the area. Small bones, picked clean and bleached white by time and weather, lay half buried beneath the fallen leaves. They were too small to belong to deer or other large forest animals, and their delicate structure suggested they had once belonged to birds or small mammals. But like the deer, there were no signs of predation or violence, no teeth marks or broken bones that would indicate they had been killed and consumed by other animals. Luna's behavior grew increasingly erratic during these visits. She would refuse to enter certain areas entirely, planting her feet firmly on the path and whimpering until I agreed to take a different route. When we did venture into the affected zones, she would stick so close to my legs that I could feel her trembling through her fur. Her eyes darted constantly between the trees, tracking movements that I couldn't see, and she would occasionally emit low growls directed at empty patches of forest. The silence in these areas was perhaps the most unnerving aspect of our discoveries. Forests should be full of life, Birds calling to each other, squirrels chattering in the branches, insects buzzing through the undergrowth. But the deeper sections we explored were completely devoid of such sounds, creating an atmosphere so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the stillness, leaving the air stagnant and oppressive. As the weeks passed, I began to notice changes in my own behavior as well. I found myself having trouble falling asleep after our forest expeditions, my mind replaying images of the dead animals and the unnatural silence that surrounded them. During the day, I caught myself staring out my bedroom window toward the forest, drawn to those dark spaces between the trees where shadows seemed to move independently of any external cause. My parents commented on my distracted behavior during dinner conversations, noting that I seemed preoccupied and withdrawn. When they asked about my hiking adventures, I found myself reluctant to share the details of what Luna and I had discovered. Something about those experiences felt too personal, too disturbing to put into words. Instead, I offered vague responses about enjoying the fresh air and exercise, while carefully avoiding any mention of the dead zones we had encountered. The dreams started around this time as well. At first, they were simply replays of our forest walks, but gradually they began to take on a more sinister quality. I would find myself alone in the woods, without Luna's comforting presence, walking through increasingly dark and twisted landscapes where the trees seemed to close in around me with each step. The dead animals from our real-world discoveries would appear in these dreams, but they were different somehow, their empty eye sockets following my movements, their decomposing mouths seeming to whisper words I couldn't quite understand. I began to wake up exhausted, as if I had actually been walking through the forest all night, rather than lying safely in my bed. My sheets were often soaked with sweat, and my legs ached as if I had been hiking for hours. The boundary between dream and reality started to blur, and I found myself questioning whether some of our forest discoveries had actually happened, or were simply products of my increasingly troubled sleep. Despite my growing unease about the strange phenomena we'd encountered in the deeper forest, an irresistible compulsion continued to draw me back to those dark, quiet places. It was as if the woods themselves were calling to me, whispering promises of secrets waiting to be discovered in their most hidden corners. Luna seemed to sense this obsession growing within me, and her reluctance to venture into certain areas became more pronounced with each expedition. On a particularly overcast morning in early summer, I decided to explore a section of forest we had never visited before. The sky was heavy with threatening clouds, and the air carried the electric tension that precedes a thunderstorm. Luna had been acting especially nervous since we left the house, constantly looking back toward home and whimpering softly whenever I urged her forward. But I was determined to push deeper into the wilderness than we had ever gone before, driven by an inexplicable need to uncover whatever truth lay hidden in the forest's heart. The path we followed that day was barely visible, more of an animal trail than anything created by human passage. It wound through increasingly dense vegetation, forcing us to duck under low-hanging branches and push through tangles of thorny undergrowth that caught at our clothes and scratched our skin. The trees grew closer together as we progressed, their massive trunks creating a natural barrier that blocked out what little light filtered down from the storm-darkened sky above. As we walked, I began to notice that the forest floor was changing beneath our feet. The usual carpet of fallen leaves and decomposing vegetation gave way to bare earth that felt strangely compacted, as if countless feet had walked this path before us. The soil was darker here, almost black, and it had an oily quality that seemed to repel water rather than absorbing it. When raindrops from the gathering storm began to fall, they beaded up on the surface like mercury on glass, creating small pools that reflected the gray sky overhead. Luna's distress became more apparent with each step we took along this strange path. She began to pant heavily despite the cool temperature, and her fur stood on end along her spine as if she were being constantly stimulated by static electricity. Several times she tried to turn back, tugging against her leash with surprising strength, but I was too consumed by curiosity to heed her warnings. The compulsion to continue forward had become almost overwhelming, drowning out my rational thoughts with an urgent need to see what lay ahead. The smell that had plagued the other dead zones we'd discovered was present here as well, but stronger and more complex. Beneath the familiar stench of decay was something else, a metallic odor that reminded me of old pennies mixed with the smell of rain on hot pavement. It seemed to rise from the dark soil itself, as if the earth was exhaling some poisonous breath that carried the essence of everything that had ever died within its boundaries. As we rounded a bend in the path, the trees suddenly opened up to reveal a clearing unlike anything I had ever seen. It was perfectly circular, perhaps 50 feet across, with the same black soil covering its entire surface. But what made this place truly unsettling was its complete lack of vegetation. No grass, no weeds, no small saplings trying to reclaim the open space, just bare, dark earth that seemed to absorb light rather than reflecting it. In the center of this barren circle stood a single object that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was a wooden post, perhaps 8 feet tall, driven deep into the ground and weathered to a gray bone-like color by years of exposure. Rope hung from iron rings mounted near its top, the frayed ends swaying gently in the breeze despite the fact that I couldn't feel any wind movement in the oppressive air of the clearing. Luna's reaction to the sight of this post was immediate and violent. She began to bark frantically, a high-pitched sound of pure terror that echoed off the surrounding trees and seemed to multiply until it felt like a dozen dogs were giving voice to their fear. She threw herself backward with such force that the leash was yanked from my grip, and she immediately bolted toward the tree line, disappearing into the shadows between the trunks. For a moment I stood alone in that terrible clearing, staring at the weathered post and trying to process what I was seeing. The rational part of my mind searched for innocent explanations. Perhaps it was an old surveyor's marker, or a remnant of some long-abandoned fence line. But deep in my gut, I knew that this place had been used for something far more sinister than simple property marking. The silence that surrounded me was absolute and unnatural. Even Luna's frantic barking had faded to nothing, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere of the clearing as if the air itself was too thick to carry sound. I realized that I was holding my breath, afraid that even the smallest noise might attract the attention of whatever presence seemed to lurk in this forsaken place. The first drops of rain began to fall as I stood transfixed in that horrible clearing, each droplet hitting the dark soil with a sound like whispered secrets. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke open, releasing a downpour that should have sent me running for shelter, but I remained frozen in place, staring at that weathered wooden post while my mind struggled to process the implications of what I was seeing. As the rain intensified, something extraordinary and terrifying began to happen. The water hitting the black soil didn't soak in as it should have, but instead began to pool and flow across the surface, creating dark rivulets that moved in patterns too organized to be natural. The streams of water seemed to be following invisible channels carved into the earth, all flowing toward the central post like spokes on some macabre wheel. Within minutes, the entire clearing had become a shallow lake of muddy water that reflected the storm-darkened sky above. But as I watched in growing horror, the reflection in the water began to show something different than what I could see when I looked up. In the surface of the pooled rainwater, the sky appeared to be on fire, painted in shades of orange and red that pulsed and writhed like living flames. Shadows moved across this reflected inferno, shapes that resembled human figures dancing around a central point that corresponded exactly to where the wooden post stood in the real world. The temperature around me seemed to drop dramatically as the vision in the water became clearer. I could make out individual faces in the dancing shadows now, their mouths open in expressions of agony or ecstasy that was impossible to distinguish. Their movements were frenzied, desperate, as if they were trying to communicate some urgent message that I was too dense to understand. The longer I stared into the water, the more convinced I became that these figures were looking back at me, their burning eyes pleading for something I couldn't give them. A sound began to emerge from the reflected scene, faint at first but growing steadily louder. It was a combination of singing and screaming, voices raised in some kind of chant that sent shivers down my spine despite the supernatural cold that had settled over the clearing. The words were in no language I recognized, but somehow their meaning felt familiar, as if they were speaking directly to some primitive part of my brain that understood things my conscious mind refused to acknowledge. I don't know how long I stood there, mesmerized by the horrific tableau playing out in the pooled rainwater at my feet. Time seemed to have stopped entirely, and I felt as if I could have remained in that position forever, watching the eternal dance of the tormented figures below. But eventually, Luna's distant barking penetrated the trance that had settled over my mind, reminding me that there was still a world beyond this nightmare clearing. Tearing my gaze away from the water took every ounce of willpower I possessed. The vision clung to my consciousness like smoke, leaving after images burned into my retinas that continued to dance across my field of vision even when I looked away. My legs felt weak and unsteady, as if I had been standing in that spot for hours rather than minutes. and my clothes were completely soaked through despite the fact that I couldn't remember feeling the rain hitting my skin. Following the sound of Luna's barking, I stumbled toward the edge of the clearing, my feet splashing through the shallow water that covered the dark soil. With each step away from the central post, the oppressive atmosphere began to lift slightly, and I found myself able to breathe more easily. But the images from the water continued to flash through my mind, and I knew with absolute certainty that I would never be able to forget what I had witnessed in that place. I found Luna cowering behind a massive oak tree just beyond the tree line, her fur plastered to her body by the rain and her eyes wide with terror. She was shaking so violently that I could hear her teeth chattering, and she flinched away from me when I first approached, as if she no longer recognized me as someone safe and familiar. It took several minutes of gentle coaxing before she would allow me to clip her leash back on, and even then she kept looking back toward the clearing with an expression of pure dread. The journey home was a nightmare of wrong turns and false paths. The rain had transformed the forest into a labyrinth of running water and slippery mud, making it nearly impossible to distinguish the trail we had followed earlier. Luna seemed to have lost her usual ability to navigate, and she kept trying to lead us in directions that took us further away from home rather than closer. Several times we found ourselves walking in circles, passing the same fallen log or distinctive rock formation multiple times before realizing our mistake. As we struggled through the increasingly difficult terrain, I became aware that we were being followed. At first it was just a feeling, a prickle of awareness at the back of my neck that suggested unseen eyes were watching our progress. But gradually, I began to catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that slipped between the trees just out of direct sight. When I turned to look directly at these movements, there was never anything there, but the feeling of being observed grew stronger with each passing minute. 3 weeks after our terrifying experience in the clearing, I finally worked up the courage to venture back into the forest with Luna. The memory of that rain-soaked afternoon had haunted my dreams every night since, and I was desperate to prove to myself that what I had seen was nothing more than a stress-induced hallucination brought on by too many hours spent exploring the darker corners of the woods. Luna was reluctant to leave the familiar paths near our house, but I managed to coax her deeper into the forest by taking a completely different route than the one that led to the clearing. We headed east instead of north, following a deer trail that wound through a section of woods I had never explored before. The trees here were different, younger and more widely spaced, allowing dappled sunlight to filter through the canopy and create a more cheerful atmosphere than the oppressive darkness we had encountered in other areas. For the first hour of our hike, everything seemed normal. Luna gradually relaxed her guard, and her tail began to wag again as she investigated the new scents and sounds of this unfamiliar territory. Birds chirped in the branches overhead, and small woodland creatures rustled through the undergrowth in their endless search for food. It felt like a return to the innocent adventures we had enjoyed during our first months of exploration, before we had stumbled into the forest's darker secrets. The path we followed led us gradually downhill, through groves of towering pine trees where the forest floor was carpeted with a thick layer of brown needles that muffled our footsteps. The air here was filled with the clean, resinous scent of evergreens, a welcome change from the decay and stagnation that had characterized our recent expeditions. I began to relax for the first time in weeks, feeling that perhaps I had been overreacting to the strange phenomena we had encountered. But as we continued deeper into this new section of forest, I began to notice familiar signs that made my stomach clench with dread. The bird songs gradually faded away, replaced by an unnatural silence that seemed to press in around us from all sides. The temperature dropped noticeably, despite the warm sunshine that had been filtering through the trees just minutes before. Luna's ears perked up and she began to move more cautiously, her nose twitching as she caught scents that put her on high alert. The trees began to change as well, becoming older and more gnarled with each step we took. Their branches hung lower, creating a canopy so thick that very little light could penetrate to the forest floor below. The pine needles beneath our feet gave way to the familiar carpet of decomposing leaves and black soil that I had learned to associate with the forest's darker regions. Even the air felt different here, thicker and more oppressive, carrying odors that made my throat tighten with each breath. When we finally reached our destination, I understood immediately why Luna had been growing more agitated as we approached. Before us lay a body of water unlike anything I had ever seen, a pond perhaps 60 feet across, but so dark that it might as well have been a hole punched through the earth into some lightless abyss below. The surface was perfectly still, like black glass reflecting nothing despite the fragments of sky visible through the canopy overhead. The water's edge was ringed with soft, muddy soil that looked treacherous to navigate. There were no reeds or cattails growing around the perimeter, no lily pads floating on the surface, no signs of the aquatic life that should have inhabited such a large body of water. Even more disturbing was the complete absence of sound. No gentle lapping of water against the shore, no croaking of frogs or buzzing of insects. The pond existed in a bubble of absolute silence that seemed to absorb sound rather than allowing it to travel across the water's surface. But what drew my attention most powerfully was the object protruding from the center of the dark water. A large branch, or perhaps the top of a submerged tree, stuck up from the depths like a skeletal finger pointing toward the gray sky above. Its bark had been stripped away by time and weather, leaving behind smooth, bone-white wood that seemed to glow with its own faint luminescence in the dim light of the forest. Luna's reaction to the sight of this place was immediate and intense. She began to whimper in the same high-pitched tone I had heard during our visit to the clearing, and she paced back and forth along the pond's edge with obvious distress. Her hackles rose along her spine, and she kept looking back at me with an expression that clearly said we needed to leave this place immediately. But I found myself drawn to the edge of the dark water, despite every instinct screaming at me to retreat. There was something mesmerizing about the pond's perfect stillness, something that made me want to understand what lay beneath that black surface. I moved closer to the muddy shore, feeling my feet sink slightly into the soft soil with each step, until I was standing just inches from the water's edge. The longer I stared into the dark water, the more convinced I became that I could see something moving in its depths. At first, it was just a vague sense of motion far below the surface, like shadows shifting in the corners of your vision. But as my eyes adjusted to the pond's unnatural darkness, shapes began to resolve themselves into more distinct forms that made my heart race with terror. There were objects down there, large, pale things that drifted slowly through the black water like lazy fish. They were too far below the surface to make out clearly, but their movements were wrong somehow, too fluid and graceful to be debris or dead vegetation. As I watched, one of these shapes drifted closer to the surface, and for a brief, horrible moment, I thought I could make out the outline of a human form floating just beneath the water's skin. Luna's distress reached a crescendo behind me, her whimpers rising to sharp, staccato barks that pierced the unnatural silence surrounding the pond. The sound seemed to echo strangely in this place, as if the water itself was absorbing and distorting the noise before releasing it back into the air. But her warnings fell on deaf ears. I was completely transfixed by what I was seeing, or thought I was seeing, in the depths below. The pale shape that had drawn closer to the surface began to rise, and I found myself leaning forward to get a better look. The muddy soil beneath my feet grew softer and more treacherous as I approached the water's edge, but I barely noticed the danger. All of my attention was focused on the thing that was slowly ascending from the pond's dark depths, bringing with it promises of answers to questions I hadn't even known I was asking. As the shape rose higher, more details became visible through the murky water. It was definitely human in form. I could make out arms, legs, and what appeared to be long hair floating around a pale face. But there was something fundamentally wrong with its proportions, as if it had been stretched or distorted by its time in the water. The limbs seemed too long, the torso too narrow, and the head tilted at an angle that suggested the neck had been broken. But it was the eyes that truly horrified me. Even through the distorting medium of the dark water, I could see that they were wide open, staring directly up at me with an intensity that felt like physical pressure against my skull. They didn't blink or waver, but remained fixed on my face with an expression of desperate hunger that made every nerve in my body scream warnings I was too mesmerized to heed. The floating figure continued to rise, and I realized with growing dread that it was going to break the surface at any moment. Part of me wanted to run, to grab Luna and flee from this accursed place before whatever was in the water could emerge into the world above. But a larger part of me was convinced that I needed to see this thing face to face, to understand what it was and what it wanted from me. Just as the pale shape seemed about to break through the water's surface, Luna's terror reached a breaking point. She let out a bark so loud and sharp that it felt like a physical blow to my eardrums, jolting me out of the trance that had settled over my mind. The sound shattered the unnatural silence of the pond like glass, and its echoes seemed to bounce back and forth between the surrounding trees for far longer than should have been possible. The effect on the thing in the water was immediate and dramatic. It stopped its upward motion abruptly, as if Luna's bark had created some kind of barrier it couldn't cross. For a moment it hung suspended just below the surface, its terrible eyes still locked on mine with that same desperate hunger. Then, slowly, it began to sink back into the depths, its pale form growing fainter and more indistinct until it disappeared entirely into the black water. But as it descended, I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. The dead branch that protruded from the center of the pond was gone. One moment it had been there, a landmark pointing toward the sky, and the next it had simply vanished without so much as a ripple to mark its passing. The surface of the water remained perfectly smooth and undisturbed, as if nothing had ever broken its black mirror finish. That's when I realized with absolute certainty that the branch had never been a piece of dead wood at all. It had been part of the thing in the water, an arm or leg extended above the surface, waiting patiently for someone like me to come close enough to be pulled down into the depths. The thought of how near I had come to wading into that dark pond made my knees weak with retroactive terror. Luna's continued barking finally penetrated the shock that had paralyzed me, and I stumbled backward from the water's edge on unsteady legs. The soft mud tried to hold on to my feet with each step, as if the pond itself was reluctant to let me go, but I managed to reach firmer ground where Luna waited for me with obvious relief. Her tail was tucked firmly between her legs, and she kept looking back toward the water with the kind of primal fear that only animals seem capable of expressing. As we prepared to leave that cursed place, I made the mistake of looking back one final time. The surface of the pond remained perfectly still, showing no sign of the horror that lurked in its depths. But I could swear I saw something pale moving just below the surface, and for a terrifying moment I thought I could make out a human face staring back at me from the dark water. A face with wide, desperate eyes and a mouth opened in what might have been a scream or a plea for help. The journey back through the forest was a nightmare of stumbling steps and constant fear. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hide watching eyes, and every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, made both Luna and me jump with terror. The comforting familiarity of the woods had been forever shattered by what we had witnessed at the dark pond, and I knew with absolute certainty that I would never feel safe in these places again. Luna stayed pressed against my legs as we walked, her warm body trembling with residual fear. She kept looking back over her shoulder toward the pond, as if expecting to see something pale and dripping emerging from the trees behind us. Her usual confidence in navigating the forest trails had evaporated completely, and more than once she led us in the wrong direction, forcing us to backtrack and search for the correct path home. The sun was beginning to set by the time we finally reached the edge of our property, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded me uncomfortably of the vision I had seen reflected in the pooled rainwater weeks earlier. The familiar sight of our house should have been comforting, but even the warm light glowing in the windows couldn't dispel the chill that had settled deep in my bones. My parents were waiting for us on the front porch, their faces creased with worry. We had been gone much longer than usual, and the approaching darkness had clearly concerned them. They asked the usual questions about our hike, where we had gone, what we had seen, whether we had encountered any problems. But how could I possibly explain what had really happened? How could I tell them about the dark pond and the thing that lived in its depths, waiting for unwary visitors to come close enough to drag down into the black water? Instead, I mumbled something about losing track of time and getting turned around on unfamiliar trails. They seemed satisfied with this explanation, though I noticed my mother giving Luna's disheveled appearance a concerned look. The dog's usually pristine golden coat was muddy and tangled, and her eyes still held traces of the terror we had experienced together. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to close my eyes without seeing that pale shape rising from the dark water. Every time I began to drift off to sleep, I would jolt awake with the sensation that something was standing beside my bed, watching me with hungry eyes. The rational part of my mind tried to convince me that it had all been an elaborate hallucination, a product of too many weeks spent exploring the darker corners of the forest. But deep down, I knew that what I had seen was real, and that knowledge filled me with a dread that no amount of logical reasoning could dispel. Over the following days, I found myself constantly drawn to my bedroom window, staring out at the forest that stretched beyond our backyard. During daylight hours, the woods looked peaceful and inviting, showing no signs of the horrors that lurked in their hidden depths. But as night fell and shadows began to gather between the trees, I could swear I saw movement in the darkness, pale shapes flitting between the trunks, always just at the edge of vision and gone the moment I tried to focus on them. Luna's behavior changed dramatically after our encounter at the pond. She no longer showed any interest in our forest expeditions, and would whimper and hide whenever I reached for her leash. Even short walks around the neighborhood seemed to distress her, and she would constantly look back toward the house as if desperate to return to safety. The joyful, adventurous companion who had shared so many explorations with me was gone, replaced by a nervous, frightened animal who jumped at every unexpected sound. Weeks passed, and gradually the immediate terror of our experience began to fade into a persistent, low-level dread that colored every aspect of my daily life. I stopped hiking entirely, unable to face the thought of returning to those dark places where things that should not exist waited patiently for the next unwary visitor. My parents noticed the change in my behavior, commenting on how I seemed withdrawn and listless. But I could never bring myself to tell them the real reason for my transformation. The dreams, however, continued with relentless persistence. Night after night, I found myself standing beside that black pond, watching pale shapes drift through its depths like drowned souls seeking release from their watery prison. Sometimes the dreams were simple replays of our actual encounter, but more often they took on a more sinister quality, with the thing in the water successfully breaking the surface and reaching for me with fingers like bleached bone. In the most terrifying version of the dream, I would find myself walking into the pond despite every instinct screaming at me to flee. The dark water would close over my head, and I would sink into a world of absolute blackness where pale figures drifted past me in the depths, their dead eyes reflecting a hunger that could never be satisfied. I would wake from these dreams gasping for air, my sheets soaked with sweat, and my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would burst from my chest. Months have passed since that terrible day at the pond, and I've never returned to the forest. Luna and I have found other ways to exercise and explore, staying safely within the boundaries of civilization where such horrors cannot reach us. But sometimes on quiet nights when the wind blows through the trees beyond our yard, I swear I can hear something calling to me from the darkness, a voice like water lapping against a muddy shore, promising secrets and revelations that no living person should ever discover. I know now that there are places in this world where the normal rules don't apply, where things that defy explanation wait patiently for the curious and the foolish to stumble into their domain. The Dark Pond is one such place, and I pray to God that I never have the misfortune to discover another. Some secrets are too terrible to uncover, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. The forest still calls to me sometimes, especially in the dead of night when sleep refuses to come. But I've learned to resist that call, to stay safely within the boundaries of the known world, where pale things don't drift through black water and weathered posts don't mark places where unspeakable ceremonies once took place. Luna understands this lesson too, and together we've found peace in the ordinary, mundane world where the most dangerous thing we're likely to encounter is a traffic jam or a difficult homework assignment. But I'll never forget what we saw in those dark depths, and I'll never stop wondering about the other secrets that lie hidden in the places where civilized people fear to tread. The forest keeps its mysteries well, and perhaps that's for the best. Some doors once opened can never be closed again, and some knowledge once gained can never be forgotten. The Adirondack Wilderness stretches like an ancient slumbering beast across upstate New York. Most tourists and weekend hikers never venture beyond the maintained trails and designated camping areas. They never learn what waits in the deeper woods, in the places where cell service dies and compasses spin uselessly in your palm. I wish I had been one of them. My name is Alex. 3 days ago, I was a normal person with a normal life and normal problems. Now I'm hunched over a dying phone in a makeshift shelter, typing this as a record of what happened to us, hoping someone will find it. The battery won't last much longer. Neither will I, probably. It was Jordan's idea to go on this trip. Jordan, with his REI membership and his expensive hiking boots and his Instagram feed full of summit photos. He convinced Danny and me that we needed to disconnect and recharge in nature. We had been friends since college. The three of us, and our annual trips were sacred. This year was supposed to be special, a week-long trek through a remote section of the Adirondacks that Jordan had researched for months. This route isn't even on most maps, he'd boasted during our planning session, spreading out a topographical chart across my kitchen table. There's an old hunting trail that follows a creek bed up to Mirror Lake. The view is supposedly incredible, and we'll have it all to ourselves. Danny had raised an eyebrow. If it's not on the maps, how do you know about it? Jordan had grinned. Reddit. This guy in Adirondack backcountry posted about it. Said his grandfather used to hunt there in the 50s. He gave super detailed directions. I should have seen the warning signs then. Jordan's unusual secrecy about our exact route. The way he dismissed the park ranger's concerns when we registered our hike. The strange symbol he'd drawn on our map at Mirror Lake. But I was caught up in the excitement, the promise of adventure. The first day went perfectly. We hiked through sun-dappled forests, crossed crystal-clear streams, and spotted deer watching us curiously from behind oak trees. Jordan navigated confidently, consulting his map only occasionally. We made good time and set up camp in a picturesque clearing just as the sun was setting. That night, as we sat around the campfire, Jordan finally told us the rest of the story. The Reddit post wasn't just about a secret trail, he admitted, his face eerie in the flickering firelight. The guy's grandfather told him stories about something that lived in these woods. Something the local Algonquin people feared. Danny groaned. Please tell me you didn't drag us out here because of some creepy Reddit story. Jordan's expression remained serious. The post got deleted a few hours after I read it. The user's account too, but I saved the coordinates in the story. So what was it? I asked, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. They called it Wanagiyata, the spirit that walks in another's skin. A skinwalker, Danny whispered. I laughed uncomfortably. You mean like those stories from Navajo folklore? We're nowhere near Navajo territory. Different tribes have different versions, Jordan said quietly. But they all talk about something similar. A human who can take the form of animals. A hunter that can mimic voices. He poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. The Reddit guy said his grandfather encountered it in 1956. He was the only survivor from a hunting party of 5. What happened to the others? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Jordan looked up, his eyes reflecting the flames. They disappeared one by one. The grandfather said he kept hearing their voices at night, calling from the woods, but he knew they were already gone. We sat in silence for a moment, the forest suddenly seeming much darker beyond our little circle of light. That's just a story, Danny said finally. People have been telling scary campfire tales forever. Of course, Jordan agreed quickly. I just thought it added some atmosphere to our trip. We laughed it off and turned to lighter topics. Later, in my tent, I drifted to sleep listening to the wind in the trees and thinking about ancient fears and modern legends. I woke to the sound of movement outside my tent, the soft crunch of footsteps on leaves, deliberate and slow. My watch read 3:17 a.m. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps circled my tent once, twice, then stopped at the entrance. I could see a shadow against the thin fabric, human-shaped but somehow wrong, the proportions subtly distorted. Jordan, I whispered. Danny. No response. Just the sound of breathing, heavy and wet, like something with damaged lungs. Then it spoke. Alex, it said in Jordan's voice, perfect in every detail. Come out. You need to see this. Every instinct screamed danger. This wasn't Jordan. I knew it with a certainty that bypassed rational thought. I'm sleeping, I called back, my voice surprisingly steady. Tell me in the morning. A long pause. The shadow remained. All right, it said eventually, still in Jordan's voice. Sleep well. The shadow withdrew. I heard the footsteps recede into the forest, leaving only the sound of my hammering heart. I lay awake until dawn broke, afraid to move, afraid to call out to my friends. When morning came, Jordan and Danny were in their tents, apparently having slept through the night. I said nothing about my visitor. Who would believe me? Instead, I watched them carefully as we packed up camp, looking for any sign that something was wrong. But they seemed normal. Jordan checking his map, Danny complaining about her sore shoulders. We continued hiking, deeper into the wilderness, following Jordan's mysterious trail. The forest grew denser, older. The trees here were massive, their canopies blocking most of the sunlight. The air felt heavy, pregnant with expectation. That's when we found the first sign that something was very wrong. A crude symbol carved into a massive oak tree, a circle with a single vertical line through it. Fresh, the exposed wood still pale against the dark bark. Jordan, Danny said slowly, isn't that the same symbol you marked on your map? Jordan's face drained of color. That's not possible. I made it up. It was just something I doodled while reading that Reddit post. But there it was, unmistakable and impossible. And as we stood there, staring at this inexplicable mark, we heard it, the distant sound of someone calling my name, using Danny's voice. The descent into nightmare had begun. We stood frozen before the marked tree, the distant echo of Danny's voice, or something wearing her voice, fading into the forest. "That wasn't me," Danny whispered, clutching my arm. Her fingers dug into my skin with desperate strength. "I didn't call you." Jordan was already backing away from the tree, his eyes darting between the symbol and the dense woods surrounding us. "We need to get back to the main trail," he said, now. For once I agreed with him completely. We hastily repacked our gear, abandoning our plan to reach Mirror Lake. None of us mentioned what we'd heard or the impossible symbol. To acknowledge it would make it real, and we weren't ready for that reality. We turned back the way we came, Jordan consulting his GPS with shaking hands. After an hour of rapid hiking, he stopped abruptly. "This isn't right," he muttered, looking up at the canopy of ancient trees above us. "We should have hit the creek crossing by now." I checked my own phone's compass app. The needle spun wildly, settling momentarily in one direction before whirling again. "Maybe we took a wrong turn," Danny suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. Jordan shook his head. "I've been following our exact route back. It's like," he hesitated, "like the landscape has changed." The forest did feel different. Older, more primeval. The trees here were massive, their gnarled trunks covered in thick moss. The undergrowth was sparse, as if nothing could flourish in the perpetual twilight beneath these giants. And there was a stillness, an absence of the usual forest sounds. No birds called, no insects hummed. "Let's try heading east," I suggested. "We'll eventually hit a trail or a road." We walked for hours. The forest remained unchanging, an endless procession of ancient trees. Our GPS showed us moving, but the landmarks Jordan had noted on the way in. Distinctive rock formations, a fallen tree bridging a ravine. The creek itself were nowhere to be found. As dusk approached, we were forced to make camp in a small clearing. None of us wanted to be in these woods after dark, but continuing to wander blindly would be even more dangerous. We worked silently, efficiently, setting up our tents in a tight cluster. "No fire tonight," Jordan said quietly. "I don't want to attract attention." We ate cold rations sitting close together, the failing light turning the forest around us into a wall of impenetrable shadow. No one mentioned what had happened earlier. No one suggested telling scary stories around our non-existent campfire. As darkness fell completely, we retreated to our tents with mumbled goodnights. I lay in my sleeping bag, exhausted but too wired to sleep. Outside, the forest was silent in a way that felt deliberate, as if it were holding its breath, waiting. I must have dozed eventually because I woke suddenly to the sound of movement outside. Not footsteps this time, but something large moving through the underbrush, circling our camp. I lay perfectly still, listening as it completed one circuit, then another. Then came the voices. Alex. My mother's voice, exactly as I remembered it from childhood. "Baby, I'm lost. Help me find my way." My heart seized. My mother had died when I was 14. "Alex, please." Now my father's voice breaking with emotion. "She needs you. We both do." I pressed my hands over my ears, tears streaming down my face. They weren't real. They couldn't be real. The voices changed, becoming Jordan, becoming Danny, pleading for help, screaming in pain, whispering terrible secrets. I curled into a ball, trying to block out the sounds, knowing with terrible certainty that whatever was out there was learning, practicing, perfecting its mimicry. Morning came after an eternity. I emerged from my tent to find Donnie already up, her face haggard and eyes red-rimmed. "Did you?" she began. "Yes," I cut her off. "All night." Jordan's tent was empty, his sleeping bag neatly arranged as if he'd never used it. "Jordan?" I called, trying to keep the panic from my voice. "Jordan!" We found his boots neatly placed outside his tent, but no other sign of him. His backpack was still there, water bottle and GPS still inside. It was as if he had simply vanished in the night, or been taken. "We have to find him," Danny said, already stuffing essentials into her day pack. I nodded, trying to ignore the voice in my head that whispered Jordan was already gone. that we'd never see him again. Not the real Jordan, anyway. We searched the area around our camp, calling his name despite the risk of attracting unwanted attention. About 50 yards from our tents, Danny stopped suddenly. "Look," she said, pointing to a tree. The symbol again, the circle with a vertical line, freshly carved into the bark, and beneath it something that made my skin crawl. A perfect handprint pressed into the trunk, as if someone had pushed their palm into clay. But this was solid wood, impossibly marked. "We need to go," I said, grabbing Danny's arm. "Now." We packed up camp in record time, leaving Jordan's tent and most of his gear. We could only carry the essentials if we wanted to move quickly. I took his GPS, though it had proven useless in this strange forest. We chose a direction east, according to the unreliable compass, and started walking. Neither of us mentioned our missing friend or the horrors of the previous night. We just walked, pushed forward by the primal need to escape. Around midday, we found the creek, or a creek at least. It wasn't where it should have been according to Jordan's map, but it was flowing water, a potential path out of the wilderness. "We should follow it downstream," I said. "It has to lead somewhere." Danny nodded, her face set in grim determination. We began making our way along the bank, the dense underbrush forcing us to wade through the shallow water in places. That's when we saw it, a figure standing among the trees on the opposite bank. Jordan watching us silently, his face expressionless. "Jordan!" Danny cried, relief flooding her voice. She started toward the creek crossing, but I grabbed her arm. "Wait," I said, studying the distant figure. Something was wrong. Jordan stood too still, his posture rigid and unnatural, and his feet weren't touching the ground. As we watched in horror, the figure began to change, its limbs elongated, body twisting and reshaping itself with sickening fluid motions. Within seconds, Jordan was gone, and in his place stood something else, something tall and gaunt with too many joints and skin that hung loosely, as if it didn't quite fit. Danny's scream tore through the forest silence. The creature's head snapped toward us, though it had no visible eyes, just smooth, featureless skin where a face should be. It began moving toward the creek, its gait jerky and wrong, like it was still learning how to use its limbs. We ran. Abandoning the creek, we crashed through the underbrush, blind with terror. Branches whipped our faces. Roots threatened to trip us, but we kept running, driven by the knowledge of what followed. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs threatened to collapse. Only then did we stop, gasping for breath, listening for pursuit. The forest had fallen silent again. No sign of the creature, but somehow that was worse. At least when we could see it, we knew where it was. As our breathing steadied, a new sound emerged from the silence. Soft, rhythmic chopping from somewhere ahead of us. "Do you hear that?" Danny whispered. "It sounds like an axe." Hope surged through me. Woodcutters, hunters, someone human. We moved cautiously toward the sound, alert for any sign of our pursuer. The chopping grew louder until we emerged at the edge of another clearing. In the center stood a small, crude cabin, so weathered it seemed to grow from the forest floor. Smoke curled from a stone chimney. Outside, a figure in flannel was splitting logs with methodical precision. "Hello," I called out, too desperate for caution. "We need help." The figure turned slowly, axe still raised. It was an old man, his face deeply lined, eyes sharp beneath bushy white brows. He showed no surprise at our sudden appearance. "You're being followed," he said, not a question. Danny and I exchanged glances. "Yes," I admitted. "Something's in these woods. Something that changes." The old man nodded once. "Wanagiata," he said, and my blood ran cold. "You'd better come inside." As we followed him toward the cabin, I glanced back at the forest we'd emerged from. For just a moment, I thought I saw Jordan standing among the trees, watching us with empty eyes. But it wasn't Jordan. It had never been Jordan. And I knew with bone-deep certainty that we would never leave these woods the same as we'd entered them. The cabin's interior was spare but tidy. A single room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, and walls lined with tools and dried herbs. The old man gestured for us to sit at a small table while he stoked the fire and hung a cast-iron kettle over the flames. "My name's Koda," he said, his voice like gravel underfoot. Been living in these woods for 43 years. I'm Alex, I said. This is Danny. Our friend Jordan. I trailed off, unable to finish. Gone, Coda supplied bluntly. Taken. The forest has him now. Danny made a small, wounded sound. I reached for her hand under the table. What is that thing? I asked. Jordan called it Wanagiata. Said it was some kind of skinwalker, but it's older than any name we've given it, Coda interrupted. He moved to a cupboard, retrieving 3 tin cups and a jar of dried leaves. Been here since before people. The Algonquin knew about it, so did the trappers and the loggers who came later. Most learned to stay away from its hunting grounds. We didn't know, Danny said, her voice barely above a whisper. We were just hiking. Coda grunted. Folks nowadays always trampling where they don't belong. He poured hot water over the leaves, filling the cabin with a sharp herbal scent. Drink this. Keeps it from getting in your head too deep. We accepted the cups. The tea bitter and astringent on my tongue. What does it want? I asked. Coda settled into a chair across from us, his weathered hands cradling his own cup. What does any predator want? To feed. To survive. He took a sip before continuing. But this one's different. It doesn't just kill. It becomes. Takes not just the body but the memories, the voice, the soul. Jordan, Danny murmured. That thing we saw wasn't really him, was it? It was just wearing his... She couldn't finish. Your friend is gone, Coda confirmed. But it keeps parts of him. His voice, his memories. It uses them to hunt the rest of you. I thought of the voices in the night. My parents. Jordan. Danny. All perfect imitations designed to lure me out into the darkness. How do we escape? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The forest seems to change around us. We can't find our way back. Coda nodded slowly. The old stories say it bends the woods to its will, making paths circle back on themselves. The more frightened you are, the stronger its hold. So we're trapped? Danny's voice cracked. Not trapped, Coda said, but getting out won't be easy, and you'll need to leave before nightfall. It hunts best in the dark. He rose and moved to a wooden chest in the corner. From it he withdrew a crude map drawn on animal hide, and an ancient-looking knife with symbols etched into the blade. This map shows the true paths, he explained, spreading it on the table. The ones it can't change. Follow them exactly, and you'll reach the old fire road by sundown. From there, it's 4 miles to the ranger station. What about the knife? I asked. Coda's expression darkened. It can be wounded. Not killed, but wounded enough to retreat. The blade is white ash and silver, marked with protective symbols. If it corners you, he left the implication hanging. Why are you helping us? Danny asked suddenly. You don't know us. Coda was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant. Had a brother once, he finally said. Game warden. Came into these woods looking for missing hikers in 80. Found something else instead. His gnarled fingers traced a pattern on the table's scarred surface. I've been watching it ever since, learning its ways, helping folks escape when I can. Have you ever tried to kill it? I asked. A humorless smile creased his face. You don't kill something like that. Best you can do is understand its rules, its boundaries. He tapped the map. It won't cross running water when the sun is up. Won't enter a circle of white ash. Can't mimic someone if you're looking directly at them. He stood abruptly. Time's wasting. You need to be on the path now if you want to reach the fire road by dark. As we prepared to leave, Coda packed us a small bundle of food and filled our water bottles. He handed me the knife, its weight surprisingly heavy for its size. One more thing, he said, his voice low. If your friend appears to you again, don't listen. No matter what he says or how he pleads, that's how it takes you, makes you doubt, makes you hope, until you willingly go to it. At the cabin door, Danny hesitated. What about you? Won't it come after you for helping us? Coda's face remained impassive. Me and it have an understanding. I stay in my territory, it stays in its. Something flickered in his eyes. Most days, with the map clutched tightly in my hand and the knife secured at my belt, we set off along the faint trail Coda had marked. The old man watched from his doorway until we disappeared into the trees. The path was barely visible, just a slightly clearer route through the underbrush, marked occasionally by stones arranged in small cairns. We followed it in tense silence, jumping at every snapped twig or rustling leaf. After an hour of hiking, the forest began to change subtly. The massive ancient trees gave way to younger growth. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in dappled patterns. Bird calls returned, hesitant at first, then with growing confidence. "We might actually make it," Danny whispered, as if afraid to jinx our progress. That's when we heard it. Jordan's voice, distant but clear, calling for help. "Danny, Alex, help me. I'm hurt." Dandy stopped, her body rigid. "It sounds so real," she whispered. "Keep moving," I said, gripping her arm. "Remember what Coda said." The voice called again, more desperate this time. "Please, I can see you. I'm right here." We pressed on, following the map's path across a shallow stream and up a gentle slope. Jordan's voice followed, sometimes pleading, sometimes accusatory. "You're leaving me to die, after everything we've been through. Danny, please, Alex is lying to you." Danny's steps faltered. "What if we're wrong?" she asked, her voice small. "What if that really is him?" "It's not," I said firmly, though doubt gnawed at me. What if Coda was wrong? What if Jordan had escaped and was really calling for help? The voice changed tactics, becoming softer, more intimate. "Alex, remember that night in Chicago? Our secret. Danny doesn't know about us, does she?" I froze. Jordan and I had indeed shared a night together in Chicago last year. A moment of vulnerability and connection we'd both agreed to keep private. It wasn't something I'd told anyone, not even Danny. How could the creature know that? Unless it really was Jordan. "Alex?" Danny was watching me, concern etched on her face. "What's wrong?" I shook my head, forcing myself to keep moving. "Nothing. It's trying to confuse us." But the seed of doubt had been planted. The voice continued, revealing other secrets, other memories that only Jordan should know. With each revelation, my certainty wavered. The forest darkened as clouds gathered overhead, casting us into premature twilight. According to Coda's map, we were still an hour from the fire road. "We need to hurry," I said, picking up the pace. That's when we saw him. Jordan standing in a clearing ahead, his clothes torn and dirty, face scratched but unmistakably him. "Thank God," he said, his voice breaking with relief. "I've been looking everywhere for you." Danny started forward automatically, but I caught her arm. "It's not him," I hissed. "How can you be sure?" she demanded, tears in her eyes. "Look at him." I was looking hard at the figure that appeared to be our friend, and I noticed something. Where Jordan stood, the forest seemed distorted. The trees behind him warped slightly, as if viewed through flawed glass. "Jordan," I called, keeping my distance. "If that's really you, cross the stream and come to us." The figure that looked like Jordan hesitated, glancing down at the small stream that separated us. Coda's words echoed in my mind. "It won't cross running water when the sun is up." "It's not him," I whispered to Danny. "We need to run. Now." The thing wearing Jordan's face must have sensed our realization. Its expression changed. Humanity draining away like water, leaving something ancient and predatory in its place. "You could have made this easy," it said, Jordan's voice distorting, stretching into something inhuman. "Now I'll wear your skin while you're still screaming inside." It began to change, Jordan's form melting and reshaping, limbs elongated, joints reversed, skin rippling like cloth in the wind. What emerged was the gaunt, faceless creature we'd glimpsed earlier, but now it moved with purpose, no longer mimicking human movement. We ran. The thing followed, moving with impossible speed through the trees, always paralleling our path, never crossing the streams that intersected the trail. We sprinted desperately, following Coda's map through increasingly unfamiliar terrain. The clouds overhead thickened, and rain began to fall. Light at first, then in blinding sheets that turned the path to mud and the streams to surging torrents. "There," Danny shouted over the downpour. "The fire road." Through the curtain of rain, I could make out a wider path ahead. Overgrown, but clearly an old road cutting through the forest, just as Coda had promised. We scrambled up the embankment, relief flooding through me as our feet hit the packed gravel surface. But our relief was short-lived. Standing in the middle of the road, blocking our path, was Coda, or something wearing Coda's shape. Rain lashed across the old fire road, turning the world into smears of gray and green. The figure that looked like Coda stood motionless in our path, rain streaming down his weathered face. "You made good time," he called, his voice carrying over the storm. "But you took a wrong turn near the end. The ranger station is this way." He gestured down the road in the opposite direction from what his map had indicated. Dani and I exchanged glances, doubt clouding her features. I tightened my grip on the knife Coda had given us, its symbols seemingly alive in the rain. "Your map was clear," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "The ranger station is east." The Coda thing smiled, the expression not quite fitting on its borrowed face. "The storms confused you. Trust me, I've lived in these woods for decades." "Let's test that," I said, stepping forward. "What did you give us to drink in your cabin?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed the thing's face. There and gone in an instant. "Tea, of course." "What kind of tea?" I pressed. The creature wearing Coda's skin hesitated just a fraction too long. "Elderberry. For strength." Wrong. The tea had been bitter and sharp. Nothing like the sweet tartness of elderberry. "You're not Coda," I said, drawing the knife. "And we're not following you anywhere." The false Coda's face contorted with rage, the human mask slipping to reveal something ancient and hungry beneath. "Clever prey," it hissed, voice no longer human. "But it won't save you." It began to change, Coda's form melting away like wax under flame. What emerged was the same gaunt, faceless creature we'd seen before, but now it seemed larger, more substantial, as if each person it mimicked added to its mass. "Run," I shouted to Dani, pushing her ahead of me down the road. The creature lunged, impossibly fast. I slashed with the knife, feeling it connect with something solid yet yielding, like cutting through dense clay. The thing screeched, a sound that pierced the brain and set my teeth on edge. Black ichor spurted from the wound, sizzling where it hit the rain-soaked ground. The creature recoiled, its body twisting in unnatural angles as it retreated into the trees. "It's working," Dani cried. "The knife is hurting it." But even as she spoke, the thing was changing again, this time splitting and dividing, one form becoming two. Within seconds, we faced both Jordan and Coda, standing side by side at the forest's edge. "Alex, please," Jordan's voice, perfect in its fear and desperation. "It's really me this time. That thing was pretending to be Coda, but I escaped. I've been following you." "Don't listen to him," the Coda figure warned. "That's not your friend. The real Jordan is dead." They were playing us against each other, creating doubt and confusion. But there was one thing Coda had told us. It can't mimic someone if you're looking directly at them. I kept my eyes fixed on both figures, watching for any slip in their performance. "If you're really Coda," I said, "tell me what's special about the knife you gave us." The Coda figure smiled grimly. "White ash and silver, marked with protective symbols. It can wound the Wanagiata, make it retreat." "Correct. But anyone who'd overheard our conversation in the cabin would know that." I turned to the Jordan figure. "And if you're really Jordan, tell me what happened in Chicago last year." Jordan's face softened with recognition. "We got drunk after the conference and ended up sleeping together. We promised not to tell anyone because we didn't want to complicate our friendship." "Also correct." I felt my certainty wavering. What if one of them was real? The rain intensified, turning the fire road into a rushing stream. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in stark, frozen moments. That's when I noticed it. During the lightning flash, both figures cast the same shadow. Not human-shaped at all, but something elongated and twisted with too many limbs. "They're both fake," I whispered to Dani. "We need to make a run for it." She nodded, her face pale but determined. On 3. 1, 2. A blinding lightning strike hit a nearby tree, the thunderclap immediate and deafening. In that moment of confusion, we bolted, sprinting down the fire road through the pouring rain. Behind us, the creatures howled in unison, a sound of rage and hunger that rose above the storm. They gave chase, no longer bothering with human movement, scuttling on all fours with impossible speed. The fire road stretched endlessly before us, each bend revealing only more wilderness. My lungs burned, muscles screaming as we pushed ourselves beyond exhaustion. "There," Dani gasped, pointing ahead. Through the rain, I could make out a structure. The ranger station, its windows glowing with warm light, just a quarter mile away. The creatures were gaining on us, their inhuman speed closing the distance with each passing second. I could hear them behind us, breathing with wet, rattling sounds. "We're not going to make it," Danny cried, stumbling on the slick gravel. An idea struck me. Desperate, probably suicidal, but our only chance. I stopped and turned to face our pursuers, the knife clutched in my shaking hand.
"What are you doing?" Danny screamed. "Come on!"
"Get to the station," I shouted back. "I'll hold them off. I'm not leaving you. Go, now." The creatures approached rapidly, still wearing the forms of Jordan and Coda. They slowed as they saw me standing my ground, perhaps sensing a trap. "Last chance to surrender," the Jordan thing said, its voice almost gentle. "It doesn't have to hurt." I backed up slowly, drawing them away from Danny's escape route. "What happens to the people you take?" I asked, playing for time. "Are they still in there somewhere?" The creatures exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "They become part of us," the Coda thing explained, almost scholarly in its tone. "Their memories, their voices, their essence, nothing is wasted. So Jordan is still alive, in a way?" "In a way," it agreed, stepping closer. "He sees through our eyes now, feels what we feel." They were circling me now, moving with predatory patience. I continued backing up until I felt water at my heels, a drainage ditch beside the road, swollen with rainwater. "You won't cross running water," I said. "That's one of your rules." The Jordan thing smiled, showing too many teeth. "Rules can be bent if hunger is great enough." In one fluid motion, I slashed my own palm with the knife, letting blood mix with the rain. "Hungry for this?" I taunted, holding up my bleeding hand. Both creatures froze, nostrils flaring on faces that shouldn't have had nostrils. Their forms wavered slightly, the human disguises becoming transparent around the edges. "Blood freely given has power," the Coda thing hissed. "You know not what you offer." I backed into the rushing water of the ditch, still holding my bleeding hand aloft. "Come and get it." They hesitated at the water's edge, ancient instinct warring with hunger. Then, with a sound like tearing cloth, they began to change, human forms melting away, revealing their true nature. What stood before me now defied description. A twisting mass of limbs and faces, skin that shifted and flowed like liquid. Parts of it resembled Jordan, parts Coda, and parts something far older than humanity. It lunged across the water. I was counting on that. As the creature's mass hit the rushing current, I plunged the knife into the center of its writhing form. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The thing convulsed, its body rippling with shock waves that distorted its shape. It screamed with multiple voices. Jordan's, Coda's, and others I didn't recognize, all layered in a terrible chorus of agony. Black ichor erupted from the wound, mixing with the rainwater and my blood. Where they combined, the creature's flesh began to dissolve, melting away like sugar in hot water. I stumbled backward, watching in horror and fascination as the thing thrashed in the current, its mass diminishing with each second. It reached for me with desperate melting limbs, but the water carried it away, still shrieking, still dissolving. Within moments it was gone, leaving only a dark stain in the water that quickly dissipated. I stood there, rain washing the blood from my hand, knife still clutched in my fist. Had I killed it, wounded it, or merely dispersed it temporarily? A shout broke through my daze. Danny was running toward me, accompanied by two figures in ranger uniforms. "Alex," she cried, throwing her arms around me. "You're alive. I made it to the station. They were about to start a search." The rangers approached cautiously, taking in my bloodied hand and the knife. "Ma'am, are you injured?" one asked, already reaching for a first aid kit. "I'm okay," I said automatically, though I wasn't sure if that was true. "But my friend, Jordan, we'll organize a search party," the second ranger assured me. "But let's get you both to safety first. There's a storm warning in effect." As they led us toward the ranger station, I glanced back at the forest. For just a moment, I thought I saw a figure watching from among the trees. Not Jordan or Coda, but the old man from the cabin in the clearing. He raised a hand in salute, then turned and disappeared into the darkness. The official report listed Jordan as missing, presumed dead from exposure or animal attack. The search parties found no trace of him, nor of any cabin in the area we described. The rangers attributed our skinwalker story to trauma and exhaustion. Danny and I knew better, but we stopped trying to convince others. Some truths aren't meant to be shared. I still have the knife, though the symbols have faded to almost nothing. Sometimes, when the wind blows from the north and rain taps against my windows, I think I hear voices calling my name, my parents, Jordan, even my own voice pleading to be let in. I keep the windows locked on those nights, and I never ever answer. Because deep in the ancient forests, in the places where trails disappear and compasses fail, something waits that knows your face, your voice, your deepest secrets. Something that wants to wear your skin, and it remembers everyone who has ever escaped it. The worst part of working in the Allegheny National Forest isn't the terrain, though it's not friendly. It isn't the cold, the long stretches of radio silence, or even the rare encounters with black bears. It's the silence. It settles in thick, crawling under your skin like something alive, something hungry. And when you've been out here as long as I have, you start hearing things that shouldn't be there. Whispers in the wind, footsteps that match your own until you stop walking and then keep going for 3 more steps. It was 2003, and my name's Matt Vickers. I've been with Search and Rescue for about 11 years, working out of Warren County, Pennsylvania. 11 years of dragging bodies out of ravines, finding hikers who'd been picked clean by scavengers, and discovering campsites that looked like something had exploded from the inside out. I'm the guy they send when people go missing out here, which happens more than you'd think. The statistics don't lie. Allegheny swallows at least a dozen people every year, and we're lucky if we find half of them. Funny enough, I'm not really much of a camper myself, but you know, you go where the work is. The outdoorsy types always expect me to say I'm passionate about the wilderness, that I feel some deep connection to nature's raw beauty. Truth is, I just prefer my paycheck to come with a decent health plan. But after 11 years of walking these twisted trails, I've learned to read the forest's moods. I can tell when the air pressure drops before a storm, when the animal sounds shift from normal chatter to the kind of desperate quiet that means something's hunting. That morning started like any other, with the phone ringing at 5:47 a.m. I answered on the second ring, already knowing what I'd hear. My supervisor's voice was tight with that particular strain that comes from dealing with worried families. "We got a call about a missing hiker," he said, skipping the pleasantries. A woman, about 35, hadn't checked back in after her solo trip. Named Sarah Chen. She was supposed to return yesterday. I sat up in bed, already mentally calculating distances and search grids. Solo trips aren't uncommon out here. People come to escape their lives, clear their heads, find themselves or lose themselves depending on what they're running from. The problem is, nature doesn't care if you're looking for clarity or just want to disappear. It'll swallow you whole either way. And with Allegheny's dense forests and tricky paths that seem to shift when you're not looking directly at them, I always wonder why anyone risks it alone. Then again, I've got a twisted sense of humor about these things. Half the time when someone vanishes, I figure they probably just got tired of their suburban life and decided to start fresh somewhere else. Maybe they're sipping on a mojito in Mexico while I'm trudging through the mud, following cold trails that lead nowhere but deeper into the woods. But Sarah Chen was different. Her sister had called it in, frantic, saying Sarah never missed check-ins. She was the responsible type, the kind who planned every detail of her trips and stuck to schedules like her life depended on it. That worried me more than if she'd been some reckless adventure seeker. When the careful ones go missing, it usually means something went very wrong. I met up with the volunteer crew around noon at the ranger station. The building sat like a lonely island in an ocean of green, its windows reflecting the forest canopy in a way that made it look like the trees were watching us from inside. Local guys, good folks, but they're more into the social aspect of the job. They want to be the hero, want to carry someone to safety and get their picture in the paper. They don't want to consider the fact that heroism out here usually involves hauling a body bag through 2 miles of undergrowth while trying not to think about what's left inside. We split into groups, and I got paired with one of the younger guys, Matt Lee. He was eager, probably mid-20s, with the kind of enthusiasm that made me feel ancient. First thing out of his mouth was a joke about how I should have retired by now. His laughter echoed off the trees in a way that made me uncomfortable. Sounds carry too far in these woods, and you never know what might hear them. "You ever think about leaving all this behind?" he asked me as we checked our gear. His pack was too heavy, loaded with equipment he'd probably never use, But I didn't have the heart to tell him that most of what we carry is psychological comfort. When you're searching for someone who's been missing for 2 days, you're rarely looking for a rescue. I already did, I said, looking out into the woods where the shadows seemed to move independently of the swaying branches. That's why I'm still here. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions. A maze of towering hemlocks and ancient oaks that had been growing since before the first European settlers arrived. Between the trees, the understory was thick with mountain laurel and rhododendron, creating natural barriers that could hide a person or a body just feet from a main trail. The paths themselves were deceptive, seeming to fork and merge without any logical pattern. And I'd learned long ago that the forest had its own geography that didn't always match the maps. As we prepared to head out, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The birds were quiet. Not unusual by itself, but the quality of the silence was wrong. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a forest at rest. It was the held breath quiet of prey animals hiding from something that hunted them. Even the insects seemed muted, their usual buzzing reduced to an occasional anxious chirp. Matt Lee was bouncing on his toes, eager to get started, but I made us wait another 10 minutes, listening to the forest's rhythm. That's when I heard it, a sound like branches breaking, but rhythmic, deliberate. It came from deep in the woods, probably a mile or more away, but sound travels strangely in Allegheny. Sometimes you can hear a whisper from across a valley, and sometimes you can't hear someone screaming 50 feet away. "What are we waiting for?" Matt asked, and I realized I'd been standing motionless for several minutes, just listening. "Nothing," I lied, shouldering my pack. "Let's go find her." But as we walked toward the tray line, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't going to find Sarah Chen. Something had found her first. We trekked along the South Branch Trail for hours, following the route Sarah Chen had marked on her itinerary. The air felt off, like it was sitting heavier than it should, pressing down on us with the weight of something unseen. The trail was well maintained but narrow, winding through stands of hemlock so dense that noon felt like twilight. Every few hundred yards, we'd stop and call Sarah's name, our voices swallowed by the oppressive quiet. Matt was eager, taking point and cracking jokes to fill the silence. But I couldn't shake that feeling of being watched. It wasn't paranoia. After 11 years in these woods, I'd learned to trust that itch at the back of my neck. Something was tracking us, staying just out of sight but close enough that I could feel its presence like a cold breath on my spine. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to change around us. The trees grew taller and more twisted, their branches reaching toward each other overhead like gnarled fingers trying to block out the sky. The undergrowth became thicker, more aggressive, with thorns that seemed to grab at our clothes and roots that appeared directly in our path. I'd hiked this trail dozens of times, but it felt different now, like the forest was deliberately trying to slow us down. "Hey, Vickers," Matt said, snapping me out of my thoughts. His voice was still light, but I could hear the first hints of unease creeping in. "You ever find someone out here that wasn't, all there when you found them?" I looked at him sharply. "What do you mean, all there? Like missing pieces?" He laughed, but it was nervous. The kind of laugh that people make when they're trying to convince themselves that everything's normal. "I heard stories about hikers they found with gaps." "Once," I said, not elaborating. The memory hit me like a punch to the gut. A hunter we'd found 3 years ago, sitting peacefully against a tree as if he'd just stopped to rest. Except he'd been missing everything from the waist down, and the cuts were too clean, too precise for any animal I knew about. The official report had blamed scavengers, but I'd seen what bears and coyotes could do to a body. This was something else entirely. That shut Matt up, and we walked in silence for another hour. The trail began to slope upward, climbing toward a ridge that wasn't marked on any of our maps. The further we climbed, the more the forest seemed to press in around us, until we were walking single file through a green tunnel that muffled all sound except our own breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. After another couple of hours, we stumbled across a clearing that definitely wasn't on any map. It was small, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, and the trees around it looked wrong. They'd been growing at odd angles, reaching in different directions but not toward the sun. Some of them were bent nearly horizontal, as if something massive had pressed them down and held them there until they grew into those unnatural shapes. I've seen a lot of strange formations out here. Lightning strikes, disease, unusual soil conditions. But this one felt deliberate, like the land itself was bending to avoid something. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 20 feet across, and the ground was bare earth instead of the thick carpet of leaves that covered the rest of the forest floor. "Looks like someone made a camp here," Matt said, crouching down by what appeared to be a fire pit. His voice echoed strangely in the clearing, bouncing off the twisted trees in a way that made it sound like multiple people were speaking. But the thing is, it wasn't a fire pit. Not really. The stones were too close together, stacked in a way that didn't make sense for containing a fire. They were arranged in a perfect circle, each one carefully placed and fitted against the others like pieces of a puzzle. And the ground inside the circle wasn't charred. It was dark, yes, but with a wetness that didn't look like ash. "Yeah," I muttered, examining the stones more closely. Each one was smooth, worn as if by centuries of handling, and they were all the same size despite clearly coming from different parts of the forest. Someone tried to make it look that way. Matt was already poking around the perimeter of the clearing, and I could see his face shift from curiosity to something a little more serious. The enthusiasm was draining out of him like water from a punctured canteen, replaced by the kind of focused attention that comes when your body starts preparing for danger. "You got a light?" he asked, his voice suddenly quiet. I handed him my flashlight, and he shined it toward a small mound in the middle of the so-called camp. The beam caught something pale and artificial looking among the dark earth. His face went pale as he focused the light more carefully. "Vickers, what the hell is that?" It took me a second to process what I was seeing. It was a foot, not just any foot, but a woman's, half buried in the dirt. The cut at the ankle was clean, precise, like someone had taken a bone saw to it. But what made my stomach turn wasn't the severed limb itself. It was how fresh it looked. The flesh was still pink, the nail polish still bright red despite being chipped at the edges. Whoever she was, she'd cared enough about appearances to paint her toenails before coming out here. Before whatever had happened to her. The foot was positioned deliberately, toes pointing toward the center of the stone circle like an arrow. Around it, the dirt had been patted down smooth, and I could see the faint impressions of other shapes in the earth, shapes that might have been fingers or claws or something else entirely. Matt gagged and stumbled backward, his hand clamped over his mouth. But I didn't. You get used to it in this line of work, though this was one of the cleaner scenes I'd encountered. No blood spray. No signs of struggle, just a severed foot placed like an offering on an altar. I crouched down next to the mound, trying to piece together what I was seeing. The dirt around the foot was different from the rest of the clearing. Darker, richer, as if it had been fertilized with something organic. When I brushed some of it away, I found more bone fragments, small pieces that looked like they'd been gnawed clean. "This isn't where she died," I said finally, my voice sounding strange in the unnatural quiet of the clearing. "This is staged." Matt was barely holding it together, his face green and his hands shaking. "What do you mean?" "Someone just left her here." "Not her," I corrected, standing up and brushing the dirt from my knees. "Just a part of her." That's when it clicked. The stone circle, the positioning of the foot, the careful staging of the scene. This wasn't random. Someone or something had wanted us to find this. The fire pit wasn't a campsite marker. It was a message. And the message was clear. We were in someone else's territory now, and they were letting us know that they were watching. I looked around the clearing again, seeing it with new eyes. The twisted trees weren't just growing strangely. They were positioned to create a natural amphitheater with the stone circle at its center. The bare ground wasn't just cleared of leaves. It was worn smooth by repeated use. This place had been used for something, and judging by the bone fragments scattered in the dirt, it had been used for a long time. "Who the hell would do that?" Matt asked, his voice trembling now. He was backing toward the edge of the clearing, his instincts telling him to get away from this place as quickly as possible. I didn't answer because I didn't know, but I'd been around long enough to know when something was off, and this was beyond off. This was a deliberate display, a way of marking territory and sending a message. The question was, what kind of creature left human feet as calling cards? The shadows in the clearing were growing longer as the afternoon wore on, and I realized with a chill that the sun was starting to set. We needed to get back to the main trail before dark, but first I had to call this in. The radio crackled with static when I tried to raise the base station, and it took several tries before I got through. "This is Vickers," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We've got a situation here. Human remains partial. Grid reference." I checked my GPS and read off the coordinates. "We're going to need the coroner, and probably a forensics team. The response was garbled, but I caught the gist of it. Help was coming, but it would be morning before they could reach us. The unspoken rule in these woods is that you don't stay after sunset, especially not in a place like this. But as we prepared to leave, I took one more look at the stone circle and the severed foot. Something glinted in the fading light, something I hadn't noticed before. Half buried in the dirt near the foot was a small piece of metal, a dog tag or piece of jewelry. I knelt down and brushed the earth away, revealing a silver bracelet with an inscription I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. That's when I heard it, a sound like branches breaking, but rhythmic, deliberate. The same sound I'd heard back at the ranger station, but much closer now. It was coming from the tree line, just beyond the circle of twisted trees, and it was moving in our direction. Matt heard it too, his head snapping up like a deer sensing a predator. What was that? I slipped the bracelet into my pocket and stood up slowly, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I forced myself to stay calm, to think rationally about what we were dealing with. The sound stopped, and the silence that followed was absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind through the trees. It was the kind of silence that comes just before something terrible happens. "We need to go," I said quietly, not wanting to raise my voice in the oppressive quiet. Now, but as we turned to leave the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were already too late. Something was out there in the darkening forest, and it had been waiting for us to find its message. Now that we had, the real hunt was about to begin. We marked the spot with GPS coordinates and agreed to come back with more gear in the morning. Matt was still shaken up, his hands trembling as he tried to fold the map, and I couldn't blame him. First time seeing something like that tends to mess with your head, makes you realize that the world is a lot more dangerous than you thought. But me, I was more concerned with the fact that someone had gone through the trouble of leaving a foot behind, knowing full well we'd find it. The hike back to the main trail should have taken us 45 minutes, but it felt like hours. The forest had changed around us, becoming more hostile with each step. Branches seemed to reach out deliberately to snag our clothes, roots appeared directly in our path, and the undergrowth grew thicker and more aggressive. What had been a clear trail that morning was now a maze of obstacles that forced us to push through walls of thorns and climb over fallen logs that hadn't been there before. But worst of all was the sound that followed us. It wasn't the rhythmic breaking of branches anymore. It was something more subtle, more deliberate, footsteps that almost matched our own rhythm, but not quite. When we stopped to rest, they continued for exactly 3 more steps before falling silent. When we started walking again, there would be a pause, then the sound would resume, always staying just out of sync with our own movements. Matt heard it too, his head constantly turning toward the sound, his pace getting faster with each phantom footfall. "There's something out there," he whispered during one of our rest stops, his voice barely audible even in the oppressive quiet. I nodded, not trusting my own voice. The thing that was following us was smart enough to stay hidden, smart enough to maintain distance, smart enough to know that we knew it was there. It was toying with us, letting us know that we were being hunted but not revealing itself. The psychological effect was worse than any direct attack could have been. By the time we reached the main trail, the sun was setting, and the forest was transforming into something altogether more sinister. The familiar landmarks looked different in the fading light. Trees that had seemed welcoming that morning now loomed like twisted sentinels, and the trail itself seemed to shift and change with each step. Shadows moved independently of their sources, and the air grew thick with the smell of decay and something else, something animal and wild. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about that clearing, about those trees and how unnatural they'd felt. Like the woods themselves had recoiled from that place, bent and twisted to avoid something that didn't belong. I don't believe in ghosts or any of that nonsense, but there's something about Allegheny that goes beyond explanation. It eats people, plain and simple, and it's been doing it for a long time. I pulled out the bracelet I'd found and examined it under my desk lamp. The inscription was clearer now. "Sarah, love always, Mom." My blood ran cold as I realized what this meant. The foot we'd found belonged to Sarah Chen, the woman we'd been searching for. But if her foot was in that clearing, arranged like some kind of offering, where was the rest of her? I spent the night researching, digging through old police reports and newspaper archives, looking for any pattern that might explain what we'd found. What I discovered made my skin crawl. Over the past 20 years, there had been dozens of disappearances in Allegheny, far more than the official statistics suggested. Hikers, campers, hunters, all vanishing without a trace, leaving behind only scattered belongings and sometimes body parts arranged in ways that didn't make sense. The reports were buried deep in the files, classified as animal attacks or accidental deaths. But reading between the lines, I could see the pattern. The missing people were always found in small clearings, always with evidence of ritualistic arrangement, always with key body parts missing. And in every case, the investigating officers mentioned hearing sounds in the forest, footsteps, breathing, the rhythmic breaking of branches. We went back at first light, bringing a couple more guys with us. I was leading this time, and I noticed something I hadn't before. There were no birds, not one sound. The forest was completely silent, except for our own breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. Even the insects seemed to have abandoned this part of the woods, leaving behind an emptiness that felt almost alive. The other guys were nervous, picking up on the wrongness of the place even if they couldn't articulate what was bothering them. Their jokes fell flat, their voices echoing strangely in the oppressive quiet. We moved in single file, weapons ready, though I wasn't sure what good a knife or a service pistol would do against something that could cleanly sever a human foot. We reached the clearing again, but the foot was gone. Not dragged off by animals. Gone. The dirt wasn't even disturbed, as if it had simply vanished into the earth. Matt looked at me with panic rising in his eyes, his face pale and sweaty despite the cool morning air. Vickers. We marked it right. We did mark it. I checked the GPS twice, verified the coordinates against my notes from the night before. No mistake. We were in the right place. But the mound, the stones, all of it had vanished. The clearing looked like it had been swept clean, the earth smooth and undisturbed. Even the bone fragments I'd seen scattered in the dirt were gone. That's when I knew we weren't alone out here. The thing that had been following us the day before was still watching, still toying with us. It had cleaned up its display, erased the evidence, but it was still here. I could feel its presence like a weight on my shoulders, a constant pressure that made it hard to breathe. Matt was losing it, rambling about how things like this didn't just happen, how there had to be a logical explanation. The other guys were confused, asking if we were in the right spot, looking at me like I'd lost my mind. I shut them down, knowing this wasn't a conversation to have out here, but I could feel it now, that crawling sensation under my skin that meant we were being watched, studied, evaluated. I signaled for us to spread out, search the surrounding area. I didn't expect to find anything. Hell, I didn't want to, but protocol was protocol. We had to be thorough, had to check every possible hiding spot, even though every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of these woods and never come back. Matt stuck close to me, still rattling off questions I didn't have answers to. His voice was getting higher, more desperate, and I could see the fear starting to take hold. That's when I heard it, a snap, just beyond the tree line. It was faint, but enough to make me stop dead in my tracks. I motioned for Matt to be quiet and pointed toward the sound. It was getting closer, moving through the underbrush with the kind of careful stealth that spoke of intelligence and patience. Whatever was out there had been watching us, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I pulled out my knife, the only weapon I had on me. Stupid. I should have brought something better, something with more range. But the knife was sharp, and I knew how to use it. I'd gutted enough deer in my time to know where to cut to do the most damage. The sound was closer now, moving in a rough circle around our position. I could track its progress by the way the branches moved, by the subtle changes in the forest's ambient noise. It was big, whatever it was, and it was taking its time, studying us like a predator evaluating prey. Then I saw it. Standing just beyond the trees, barely visible in the dappled morning light, was a figure, tall, easily 7 feet, with a hunched posture that made it seem even more imposing. Its limbs were too long for its body, thin but corded with muscle, and it was covered in patchy fur that looked more like coarse hair matted with dirt and something darker. It moved awkwardly, almost like it was learning how to walk, but there was a deliberate quality to its movements that suggested intelligence. It tilted its head as it watched us, the gesture almost human in its curiosity, and I got the distinct impression that it was studying us the same way we might study insects under a microscope. Its face was the worst part. It looked like someone had tried to mash a human and a wolf together but had failed miserably. The features were elongated, stretched, with too many teeth visible in what might have been a smile. Its eyes were dark, almost black, and they reflected the light in a way that made them seem to glow. I froze, trying to process what I was seeing. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't human. But it wasn't just some animal either. It was something else. Something that occupied the space between human and beast. Something that had been shaped by the forest itself. Matt was behind me, his breathing hard and fast. But he hadn't seen it yet, hadn't looked in the right direction. I wanted to keep it that way, wanted to spare him the sight of the thing that was watching us with such obvious hunger. The creature shifted its weight, and I could see the muscles moving under its matted fur. It was preparing to move, to attack or to flee, and I had to make a decision. I could try to back away slowly, hope that it would lose interest and disappear back into the forest, or I could face it, try to drive it off before it decided we were worth hunting. But before I could make that choice, it moved. Fast, faster than something that size should have been able to move. One moment it was standing at the edge of the clearing. The next it was bounding toward us with a fluid grace that spoke of years of hunting in these woods. I barely had time to shout a warning before it was on us, and I realized with horrible clarity that we had never been searching for Sarah Chen. We had been hunting, and now we were the prey. The creature slammed into me with a force I didn't expect from something so gangly. I hit the ground hard, my head bouncing off a root, and the world exploded into stars and darkness. The wind was knocked out of me, and my knife clattered away across the forest floor, useless now when I needed it most. I could hear Matt behind me, shouting my name, but it was muffled, like my brain couldn't quite process the sound. Everything seemed to be happening underwater, slow and distorted. The creature hovered over me, its breath hot and rancid, carrying the smell of rotting meat and something else, something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. Up close I could see details that made my skin crawl. The patchy fur wasn't fur at all. It was coarse hair, slick with something dark and wet that might have been blood or saliva or something worse. The creature's skin underneath was pale, almost translucent, and I could see dark veins pulsing beneath the surface. Its fingers ended in claws that looked more like surgical instruments than natural weapons, sharp and curved and stained with substances I didn't want to identify. But it was the face that haunted me, elongated, like someone had grabbed both ends of a human skull and pulled until the features stretched and distorted. The jaw was too long, filled with teeth that were too sharp and arranged in too many rows. Its eyes were completely black, reflecting my terrified face back at me like dark mirrors. The smell hit me in waves, rot and decay, and something animal and wild, that spoke of years of killing and feeding. Whatever this thing was, it had been hunting for a long time, and it was very good at what it did. I kicked at it, scrambling to get away. But it was fast. Too fast. Its claw raked across my leg, and I felt the sharp sting of razors cutting through my pants into my flesh. The pain was immediate and intense, but it was nothing compared to the terror of seeing those black eyes studying me with such obvious hunger. Blood soaked through my pants, warm and sticky, and I could feel it pooling in my boot. The creature's head tilted as it watched the blood flow, and I swear I saw something like satisfaction in those dark eyes. It was enjoying this, drawing out the moment before the kill. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the pain, adrenaline kicking in as I rolled to the side and grabbed for my knife. My fingers closed around the handle just as the creature lunged again, and I swung wildly, more out of desperation than any real plan. The blade caught it across the arm, cutting through the matted hair and into the pale flesh beneath. The creature shrieked, not like an animal but almost like a child in pain, high-pitched and wrong. The sound echoed through the forest, bouncing off the trees and coming back to us from all directions. It backed off, surprised by the pain, dark blood dripping from the wound. But it wasn't retreating. It was reassessing, figuring out how dangerous I actually was. The intelligence in those black eyes was terrifying, more frightening than any mindless beast could have been. That gave me just enough time to get to my feet. Matt was there, pulling me up by the arm, his face pale as hell. His hands were shaking, but he was trying to help, trying to be useful in a situation that was beyond anything he'd trained for. "We have to go, now," he yelled, his voice finally breaking through the haze in my head. "That thing, what the hell is it?" I didn't answer because I didn't know, but I could see the other guys in my peripheral vision, frozen in place, their faces showing the same mixture of terror and disbelief that I felt. This wasn't something that existed in the rational world they knew. It was something out of nightmare, something that shouldn't be real. We ran, crashing through the brush like our lives depended on it, because they did. Behind us, I could hear the thing moving, following us through the underbrush. It wasn't as fast as before. The wound I'd given it was slowing it down, but it wasn't stopping. It was persistent, patient, like a predator that knew its prey would tire eventually. The forest seemed to close in around us as we fled, branches grabbing at our clothes, roots trying to trip us with every step. The terrain became more treacherous, filled with hidden ravines and fallen logs that forced us to slow down despite our desperate need for speed. We reached the rest of the group, and I could see the confusion on their faces as we burst out of the tree line, bloody and panicked. They hadn't seen what we'd seen, hadn't felt the primal terror of being hunted by something that was more intelligent than any animal had a right to be. One of the guys, Matt Bennett, stepped forward, trying to calm everyone down. He was older, more experienced, the kind of guy who'd been doing search and rescue for 20 years, and thought he'd seen everything. "Vickers, what the hell is going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." Before I could answer, the creature burst out of the trees behind us, moving with that same fluid grace I'd seen before. It crashed into Bennett like a freight train, and his scream cut through the air, sharp and short. He didn't have time to fight, didn't have time to run, didn't have time to do anything but die. The creature's claws tore into his chest, pulling flesh and bone apart like it was nothing more than wet paper. Blood sprayed across the clearing, painting the trees and the ground in arterial red. Bennett's body convulsed once, twice, and then went still, his eyes staring sightlessly at the canopy above. The rest of us were frozen in place, our minds struggling to process what we were seeing. This wasn't a bear attack, wasn't some rabid animal acting on instinct. This was deliberate, methodical, almost surgical in its precision. The creature knew exactly where to cut to cause maximum damage, exactly how much force to apply to tear through human flesh. I could hear Matt Lee swearing under his breath, his voice high and desperate. One of the other guys was praying, his words tumbling over each other in a stream of desperate pleading. But I wasn't praying or swearing. I was watching, studying, trying to understand what we were dealing with. The creature crouched over Bennett's body, its head tilted at that same unnatural angle. It seemed to be listening, waiting for something, and I realized with a chill that it was waiting for us to run. This was a game to it, a hunt, and we were the prey. Something snapped inside me. I wasn't thinking anymore, wasn't calculating odds or considering consequences. I was acting on pure instinct, the same primal rage that had kept humans alive for millions of years. I grabbed a branch from the ground, a thick piece of oak that had fallen in some long-ago storm, and swung it as hard as I could at the creature's head. The impact was solid, meaty, and the creature staggered back, surprised by the sudden attack. Dark blood ran from a cut on its scalp, and for a moment it looked almost vulnerable. But then it recovered, and the look in those black eyes changed from hunger to something much worse, anger. It growled, a sound that seemed to come from deep in its chest, vibrating through the air and into my bones. The sound was wrong, too deep, too guttural, like something that had been designed to inspire terror in human hearts. And then it did something I didn't expect. It smiled. The expression was horrible on that elongated face, stretching the features into something even more grotesque. Too many teeth, too wide, too knowing. It was the smile of a predator that had just realized its prey was more interesting than it had initially thought. For a moment, none of us moved. The creature and I stared at each other across Bennett's corpse. Predator and prey locked in a deadly standoff. I could feel the weight of its attention, the cold calculation behind those black eyes as it decided what to do next. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the trees, moving with the same fluid grace it had shown before. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, leaving behind only the smell of blood and decay and the echo of that terrible smile. For a long moment none of us moved. The silence that followed was suffocating, the kind that weighs heavy on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. The forest around us seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Matt was the first to break the silence, stumbling toward Bennett's body with tears streaming down his face. Oh God, what was that thing? What the hell was that? I didn't answer because I couldn't. I didn't have words for what we'd just witnessed. Didn't have explanations that would make sense to anyone who hadn't seen it for themselves. All I knew was that something had been hunting in these woods for a very long time, and we had just become its latest prey. By the time the backup arrived, the creature was long gone. The cleanup crew found Bennett's body, or what was left of it, but they didn't find anything else. No tracks, no signs of the thing that had attacked us. No evidence that would help them understand what had happened. It was as if the forest had swallowed all trace of the encounter, leaving behind only blood and death and the memories that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. The rest of the team was quiet, too shaken to process what we'd seen. They moved through the clearing like sleepwalkers, their faces blank with shock and disbelief. I could see them struggling to reconcile what they'd witnessed with their understanding of the world, trying to fit something impossible into the framework of their rational minds. When the authorities came asking questions, we gave them what they wanted to hear. Bear attack. It wasn't a great lie, but it was all we had, and no one was going to argue with that explanation. Not when there was a body to bury, and families to notify and paperwork to fill out. The truth was too strange, too impossible, too dangerous to share with people who hadn't seen it for themselves. But I knew better. I'd seen the intelligence in those black eyes, the deliberate way it had moved, the surgical precision of its attack. This wasn't some rabid animal acting on instinct. It was something far more dangerous, something that had been shaped by years of hunting and killing in these woods. Matt Lee left the team a few days later. He couldn't handle it, couldn't sleep, couldn't stop seeing that elongated face in his dreams. He moved to Florida, as far from the Pennsylvania woods as he could get, and I never heard from him again. The others followed suit over the next year, finding excuses to transfer to different departments or retire early. No one talked about what had happened, at least not to anyone outside the unit. I stayed on. It's what I do. But the silence in the forest was different now. It wasn't just quiet, it was listening. The trees seemed to watch me when I walked the trails, their branches moving in patterns that had nothing to do with the wind. The shadows were deeper, more active, and I could feel something moving just beyond the edge of vision. The Allegheny woods don't forget. That much I'd learned. You can walk through them 100 times, but every now and then you'll feel it, that wrongness, that sense that something's watching you, studying you, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I found out later that there were stories, old ones, about something that lived in these woods. The locals don't talk about it much, but if you ask the right people, they'll tell you about the thing that's always been here, long before we came and cut down trees and built trails. They say it's a predator, something that feeds on human flesh and grows stronger with each kill. They don't have a name for it, though. Maybe it's better that way. Names give things power, make them real in ways that silence can't. But I know it's out there, somewhere in the green darkness between the trees, waiting for the next group of searchers to stumble into its territory. The missing person reports keep coming in, just like they always have. Hikers who don't return, campers who vanish in the middle of the night, hunters who are found days later with pieces missing. The official reports blame bears, accidents, exposure, anything but the truth, because the truth is too dangerous, too impossible for most people to accept. But I know what's really happening out there. I've seen it, felt its claws rake across my flesh, looked into those black eyes and seen my own death reflected back at me. The thing in the woods is real, and it's hungry, and it's been feeding for a very long time. Sometimes I think about leaving, packing up and finding work somewhere safer, somewhere that doesn't have shadows that move independently of their sources. But I've been here too long, know these woods too well. They're part of me now, and I'm part of them, locked in a dance that started the moment I first set foot on these trails. Besides, someone has to know. Someone has to remember. Someone has to be here when the next group of searchers goes missing. When the next set of remains is found arranged in a clearing that doesn't appear on any map. Someone has to stand between the thing in the woods and the people who come here looking for peace, for solitude, for answers they'll never find. The radio crackles to life, interrupting my thoughts. Another missing person. Another search mission. Another chance to walk into the green darkness and hope I come back out alive. I check my equipment, make sure my knife is sharp, and head for the door. Outside, the forest is waiting. It's always waiting, patient and hungry, and full of secrets that mankind was never meant to know. The trees whisper my name as I walk past, their branches reaching out like fingers trying to pull me deeper into their embrace. I used to think I was the hunter, the one who tracked down the lost and the missing. But I know better now. In the Allegheny National Forest, there's only one true predator. and it's been hunting these woods for longer than human memory can recall. The silence settles in around me as I walk, thick and oppressive, crawling under my skin like something alive. And when I stop to listen, really listen, I can hear it out there in the darkness between the trees, breathing, waiting, watching. The hunt continues, just as it always has. And somewhere in the green depths of Allegheny, something is smiling with too many teeth, knowing that sooner or later, every searcher becomes the searched, every hunter becomes the hunted. The forest remembers everything, and it's still hungry.